Most people think the rise of extremist ideas online is just politics, or anger, or internet trolling. It isn't. What we're actually watching is the return of a religious worldview that never really disappeared after World War II. It just learned how to survive in modern culture. And once you see that, a lot of what's happening online suddenly makes sense. A strange thing has happened on the internet over the last few years. Young men who are angry, disaffected, and searching for meaning are increasingly gravitating towards influencers and subcultures that are obsessed with Jews, Adolf Hitler, and the Third Reich. Sometimes it shows up as irony or memes, sometimes they're just asking questions, and increasingly, it's outright praise. Here's what most people completely miss. This isn't just politics, it isn't grievance culture, and it certainly isn't just trolling. There is a spiritual and occult dimension to this movement that goes back decades, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Over the past couple months, I've been running a private reading group where we work through serious books together. Not summaries or hot takes, actual reading and discussion with the goal of Christian spiritual formation. Our first book has been Black Sun, Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism, and the Politics of Identity by Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke. I've recommended this book more than any other this past year, and the first thing that hit everyone in the room was this. Nazism was never merely political. From the beginning, it functioned as a religious system, complete with rituals, myths, sacred symbols, and a messianic figure. On page 1, Goodrick-Clarke describes Nazi rallies as, quote, quasi-liturgical, with banners, sacred flames, processions, and a kind of worship centered on Hitler himself. Then he names the spiritual core, the belief in a demonic enemy, a Jewish world conspiracy, and a myth of racial salvation. That's page 1. Not a footnote, the thesis of the book. What survived after World War II wasn't defeated politics. It was a religious worldview looking for new hosts. And it found them fast. By 1950, 5 years after Hitler's suicide, while Europe was still in rubble, fascist movements were already gathering in Rome. By 1951, delegates from Germany, Italy, Austria, France, Spain, and Sweden assembled in Malmö, Sweden, to reorganize. By 1959, George Lincoln Rockwell founded the American Nazi Party. By 1962, Rockwell and British neo-Nazi Colin founded the World Union of National Socialists. Now, George Lincoln Rockwell is worth knowing. He was a decorated World War II veteran who flew anti-submarine missions, commanded naval air support at Guadalcanal, and served through the invasion of Guam. After the war, he had what he called a, quote, religious experience. While meditating on a swastika banner and a portrait of Hitler, he experienced what he described as, quote, universal awareness, and became convinced he was called to fulfill Hitler's mission. That language, universal awareness, is explicitly mystical. This wasn't politics from the beginning, it was spiritual. And here's the strange part. The White Boy Summer video that circulated through certain reform circles in 2024, it featured George Lincoln Rockwell. The men who made and shared that video knew exactly who he was. Then, when we reach Julius Evola in the book, things get truly dark. Evola was an Italian aristocrat who immersed himself in magic, alchemy, Tantra, and Eastern mysticism. He experimented with hallucinogenic drugs. He corresponded with scholars of Kundalini Yoga. He practiced Tantric sex magic, or the pursuit of occult powers through dark rituals. And he wove all of this into a political philosophy that despised Christianity as, quote, feminine and plebeian, and the great solvent of heroic civilization. If you've encountered Enjoy the Decline in online masculinity culture, that's Julius Evola's Kali Yuga, or the Hindu Dark Age he believed we're passing through. If you've seen Return to Rome, that's Evola's veneration of pre-Christian imperial hierarchy. If you've heard Bronze Age pervert talk about the Longhouse, that's Evola's framework of feminine maternal civilization, suppressing masculine spiritual elitism. These aren't edgy internet inventions, they're recycled occult philosophy from a tantric sex magician who hated Christ. And yet, I know Christian influencers who got pretty upset when I criticized Evola publicly, and that should disturb you. For me, this wasn't abstract. In July 2024, I made a mistake. I hosted certain figures on my podcast without understanding what I was dealing with. A few weeks later, I was listening to a YouTube video, and the host mentioned Black Sun. I downloaded the free Kindle preview, the first 50 pages, figuring I'd see what it had to say. Within those 50 pages, my eyes went wide. I realized what I had brushed up against was so much deeper and darker than I could have imagined. It wasn't edgy politics. It wasn't guys joking around in group chats. It was an occult religious system set up against Christ. The symbols, the rhetoric, the obsessions, the strange spiritual tone underneath it all, suddenly it made sense. I've watched this claim my friends. I've lost at least 3 men I thought I'd do life with. I've watched them leave churches and relationships and grow bitter and angry in ways that seem to come from nowhere. This is what Goodrick-Clarke describes on page 6, quote, "By projecting grievances, fears, and anxieties onto the shadow figures of other races, religious transcendence is stunted and perverted into the dynamics of exclusion and hatred." End quote. That's exactly what I've witnessed. So in today's episode, I'm sharing our first 2 book club sessions on Black Sun. You'll hear us working through the text, the religious nature of Nazism, Lincoln Rockwell's mystical awakening, the British Nazi underground, and Julius Evola's fusion of fascism and Eastern occultism. In future sessions, we'll cover Savitri Devi, the Greek woman who transformed Nazism from a German movement into a white racial religion, and whose ideas now circulate through men who have no idea a woman invented them. We'll cover Wilhelm Landig, whose mythology gave rise to Nazi Antarctica bases, occult technologies, and UFO narratives. Did you see an ad running on Joel Webbin's show featuring Agartha and Hollow Earth? Guess what? It's related, because none of this is new. What's new is how efficiently it's being distributed online. After Black Sun, we'll read American Veda by Philip Goldberg, how Indian religious ideas entered the West through Emerson, the Beatles, yoga, and therapeutic spirituality. If Black Sun shows how occult ideas resurged on the right, American Veda shows how similar currents reshaped the left and then went mainstream. Future books I'm considering include The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Saz, which argues that psychiatry has medicalized moral and spiritual struggles to gain social control. The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment by Jeremiah Burroughs, a Puritan classic on cultivating inner peace as a spiritual discipline. The Christian Mind by Henry Blamires, on what it means to actually think as a Christian in a secular age. And Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by Dave McGowan, which investigates the strange connections between the 1960s music scene, military intelligence, and possible cultural engineering. The goal of the book club isn't just information, it's spiritual formation. We live in a culture designed to keep us reactive, distracted, and spiritually shallow. The algorithm feeds us outrage. The news cycle resets our attention every 48 hours. We're conditioned to consume, not to think. The book club is my attempt to push against that, to create a space where men and women can slow down, read deeply, and build the kind of spiritual and intellectual strength that doesn't come from scrolling, the kind that holds up when the culture doesn't. If this resonates, if you're tired of shallow outrage, algorithmic manipulation, and being spiritually reactive instead of grounded, the book club may be what you're looking for. Join us at willspencer.blog. One note before we begin. These sessions were recorded live on Zoom. The first one was in my brother-in-law's workshop just after the holidays, so this isn't my usual studio quality. What matters is the substance. Now, here are the first 2 sessions on Black Sun. All right, everybody, welcome to the first meeting of the Will Spencer Book Club. I'm very grateful for all of your interest in this book club. Thank you for your support of my platform and my work, and I'm very excited to go on this journey of reading with you over the next months and years as we begin to explore a number of different topics that are related to my life and my story, I believe our lives collectively, and what we're all pursuing as Christians and believers and residents of this world today. And so I'm very much looking forward to this. Some of you may know I do a lot of reading. I think one of the reasons for the success of my podcast platform in general is that I read all of my guest books. There is rarely, if ever, a guest who comes on my podcast with a book that they've written where I haven't read at least one of their books. Or in the case of Pastor Doug Wilson, I've read many of his books because he's written many of them. But a lot of my success as a content creator and a lot of my success in life is due to the books that I've read, which has been, in some sense, a very intentional journey, seeking to understand and learn and grow. And in some sense, there's also been a lot of serendipity involved as well.
And I think of my journey through reading as important as my journey through life in general. So I can only, through this one life and this one set of eyes, experience a very narrow slice of reality in the 70 or 80 years I may be blessed to have. But through reading, I can explore places and ideas and individuals and stories that I would never witness on my own. And so in addition to reading being a hobby or a pastime or something that I do to relax, it's also something that I do to travel beyond the bounds of my own life, hopefully to harvest ideas that I can bring to benefit my life and those whom I care about, but definitely as a journey of discovery. And that's how I approach my reading. And I'm grateful for all of you wanting to participate in this journey with me. And of course, I'm looking forward to how things will unfold in the coming months and weeks and months and years. And I have a number of books that I've got potentially lined up to take us along. But as time evolves, we'll see which ones surface and become the most relevant for what we're dealing with in the moment and how we can all grow as believers. So the first book, of course, we're going to be talking about is Black Sun by Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke. And I just want to show you real quick what this book looks like. As I was reading it, you can see it's quite heavily highlighted and noted, and a lot of that has to do with what this book meant to me when I discovered it, and how I found it, and the role that it played. We even highlighted the footnotes, some of the end notes actually as well. So just to give you a bit of background, those of you who have been following me for a while know that in July of 2024, I hosted Stone Choir on my podcast, Corey Mahler and Ryan Dumperth, or Whoa, and that turned out to be one of the big mistakes of my life. Obviously, a failure of my own discernment and research, and of course, there's a whole big story associated with that that I told in my Christ Overall article, which I will provide a link probably associated with this recording when I post it, so you can read the full story there. But in the aftermath of that event, which was mid-July, was actually a couple days before the Donald Trump assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. So I had moved into a new place, and I was getting my life set up this was previously set, something that I already planned to do. And I was listening to a YouTube channel called E511 Ministries, and he was talking, I don't remember what the subject matter was. He tended to deal with more, not dispensational, but premillennial kind of views on eschatology and how it plays into current events and occultism. And I was just listening to that as I was unpacking the boxes in my new place, and he mentioned this book, Black Sun by Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke, telling kind of a story of neo-Nazism in America. And so this was maybe a couple weeks to a month after the whole Stone Choir episode. And so just out of curiosity, I figured I would just download the Kindle previews, which I think was the first 50 or so pages, and read it. I don't quite remember why at the time, but I guess I wasn't really super excited about it. It was like, oh, I got to go check this out. It was just like, yeah, I'll check that out and see what it has to say. Well, lo and behold, I start reading the book, and my eyes are opened very wide to what I had just stepped in, what I had just been involved in. I realized in almost like a blinding flash, just within the first 50 pages, just on that first Kindle edition free, I realized that what I had been involved in was so much deeper and so much darker than I could have possibly imagined. That it wasn't bros just kind of joking around in the group chats for the lulz. It wasn't just guys even with radical politics. Those alone would have been bad enough. What I discovered is that neo-Nazism is itself an occult religion that has set itself up in opposition to Christ. And this book, Black Sun, reveals that over the course of 300 or so scholarly pages. And for those of you who have done the reading just so far, just the introduction in chapter 1 through American neo-Nazism, just those 30 or so pages, you have probably seen, as I have, when I read it again for the first time about 18 months later, I guess, just how relevant those early pages are to things that we are seeing today. Almost where I've got a couple paragraphs that I want to read that I highlighted at the time, that it's like, I feel like I see this all the time on X in not so many words, but it's definitely there. And so that was when I was able to connect my experience and the things that I had been through to something that wasn't just bound in time. It's not just something that, okay, this is just right now. It was something that stretches all the way back to the 1950s is where Black Sun picks up. However, it's sort of a prequel to this book, but not exactly. It's called The Occult Roots of Nazism, and this is also by Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke. And so that story is, I think it's from 1940 previously, showing all through the 1800s some of the occult ideas that fueled the Nazis. And perhaps that would be a book for us to read at another point in time. This book picks up after World War II to show how Nazi beliefs continue on from the United States and Europe from, I guess, the 1940s and 50s up to today. And so when thinking about the books that we could read to start this off, I wanted to start with Black Sun for a couple of different reasons. One is because it's very relevant to the political conversation today. Nick Fuentes, the Groypers, not just Stonefire, but some other ideas coming that are beginning to surface in the reform world, beginning to surface in the larger podcast world, to understand that these didn't come out of nowhere. They're tragically very, very relevant for very deep and very dark reasons. And I don't use those words casually. Like when I say deep and dark, I don't just mean in some terrestrial sense. We're talking about occult antichrist ideas that are embedded within the Nazi worldview, within the ethnic supremacy, white supremacy worldview. They're an inextricable part of that. And for anyone who's been reading the book so far, even the introduction, again, we'll get into some of those pieces, you will have seen that. And as we get further into it, talking about Miguel Serrano, Julius Evola, Savitri Devi, and others, like the idea of Eastern mystical Hinduism having embedded itself in not just Nazism, but neo-Nazism, not in dispute, as in it's inarguable. And this may be perplexing to a lot of people who see these neo-Nazi ideas being expressed in Christian terms. And this is just an example of an occult movement that's draping itself in Christian language, very convincingly, sadly, for many people, but it isn't at all. And only by penetrating to the center of what the Nazis actually believed, which is what Nazi Ecology by Mark Musser is, but penetrating to the actual center of what informs us, you can see that if you're seeing these ideas in the public and they make you feel gross or icky or there's something odd and off about it, there's a reason for that. It's your discernment, it's your conscience, it's something inside you, your spiritual Christian knowing that's pointing to something that's trying to hide. And so what I want Black Sun to do is to drag that into the light. Because when people write to me and they ask me, what book can I read to understand this phenomenon quickly? I could propose, of course, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Those are probably the two most popular. The Final Solution by Gerald Reitlinger. They're just books and books and books about the Nazi regime. But there's a way in which those books about history aren't as relevant as the roots of the beliefs that men are carrying today. Because if you were to ask them, they would not say that they are Nazis. They would say like that was a movement back then. I believe totally different things. I don't have any feelings about 1930s German culture and politics. I'm talking about America today. So they will argue that the term Nazi is not a proper label, right? They will just say they're dissident right, new right, radical right, whatever term they want to use, right? But as you listen to them speak about their beliefs, you will hear ethnic supremacy, like white people are ethnically superior, and white people in the sense being sort of like Western Europeans, Anglos, something like that. You will hear that other races are inferior. You will hear both of those, maybe not stated explicitly, but it's the clear logical conclusion of the things that people say. And you will also hear continued reference to the Jews being behind it all. Those are the three things that you will hear. Those are the distinctives. You will also hear about a return to Rome, or a sort of a more imperial kind of view. Sometimes it expresses itself in terms of monarchy. Sometimes it expresses itself in terms of setting up like a new Rome itself. Those are also occult ideas. You'll hear the terms like the Kali Yuga, or this enjoy the decline. These are manosphere ideas that themselves are tied to Julius Evola, who we'll get into in later chapters, who's a very popular and has been a very popular right-wing thinker for many years. He was also an Eastern mystic, a Tantric occultist, right? And so as we work through this book, you will begin to see that A, of course, none of these beliefs are Christian. They don't have Christian roots at all. That is its own case. And then B, these are actually occult, mystical, specifically Eastern mystical beliefs that have taken expression in the West. And that's the hard thing that I think that people struggle to understand, is how Eastern mystical beliefs can present themselves in a Western way. Everyone is familiar with what we'll probably read for the second book, which is American Veda by Philip Goldberg. He talks about yoga, and you've probably heard the word guru and karma, these kind of explicitly Hindu mystical ideas and Buddhist ideas as well, that have embedded nirvana, right, that have embedded themselves in Western culture, particularly on the political left, but also sort of generalized American culture, like chakras. People are familiar with those ideas. And so that's out there and in the public. It's like, yeah, we all grow up hearing these words, but we don't really know what they mean necessarily. That's one set of things. There's something much deeper, again, and much darker, that has embedded itself in radical right-wing politics as well. This is not well understood. This is not well recognized. People just kind of accept that these beliefs find themselves on the political spectrum. That's where we can understand them. That's not the full story. Certainly, there are men that are just interested in the politics of it, but they don't understand the aspects that are fueling it from a spiritual level. And so, as we work through Black Sun, you will see that what we're looking at on the so-called political right is not at all what it presents itself as. So my purpose for choosing this book is so that we can all disabuse ourselves of these notions and see that what has set itself up as Christian or masculine or whatever is actually explicitly evil. And just to sort of, if you want to understand that, just in your own research, you can look up the work of Madame Blavatsky, the Theosophical Society, Theosophy. There was a version of that called Arios, which will be talked about in Black Sun. Arios is the belief not so much that everyone can understand these eternal truths. It's that there's a certain version of it specifically for Aryans, which in the sense Aryan, Aryan there's something uniquely Western about them as well. So Theosophy, Ariosophy is explicitly Antichrist. Blavatsky said, and I have a presentation called Exiting the New Age where I quote this. She said, "The chiefs of the society, meaning the Theosophical Society, regard Christianity as very pernicious," that's her word, pernicious, to their aims. So what the Theosophical Society was trying to do, they regard Christianity as pernicious or dangerous or even fatal to their own aims. So in her words, this is Blavatsky's words, she says that Christianity is their enemy. And so that's the Theosophical Society, which fed into Ariosophy, which was a core part of the Nazis as well. That case is more powerfully made probably in the occult roots of Nazism. Perhaps we'll get to that down the line. But for now, what I want to explore is how these ideas, they crossed the chasm, you might say, of World War II, following the defeat of Germany, and how they began to take root in America and in Britain in the 1950s and 60s. And then how they grew from there up to the point when this book was written, which I believe was around 2000. Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke passed away, I believe, in 2002 or 2003. So this book will only take us to the turn of the millennium. But I think as we get into it, you will see that these ideas have not lost any of their potency. And in fact, there are, through the internet, through 4chan, and through this underground of the internet, not just 4chan, there are many other sites as well, Vertigo Politics, being one of them. These ideas have taken on new digital forms that have stripped away a lot of the World War II kind of aspects of dictatorship and tyranny, stripped away all the ugly stuff and sort of made it a mystical belief system that disaffected young men can locate themselves in and feel like they're a part of a grand story. And that's the real power of this, is you have now successive generations of young men who don't grow up in strong families or strong churches or strong communities or even a strong idea of what their nation is anymore. And they're looking to belong to something. And not only are they looking to belong to something, they're looking to fight for something, and they're looking to be part of a story that is larger than themselves. I think that's an innately human desire. In the underworld of the internet, biblical Christianity is not terribly popular, especially among young men, because biblical Christianity preaches discipline, self-sacrifice, humility, right? And a sort of, not a powerlessness, but also a self-skepticism. Be skeptical of your own motivations. Be skeptical of your own ideas. Always test yourself, examine yourself to see if you're in the faith. That is what biblical Christianity preaches. But going back at least as early as J.C. Ryle in his book Thoughts for Young Men, which I strongly recommend, none of this is new. Men do not always willingly submit themselves to a higher righteous authority. J.C. Ryle was writing about that in the 1800s. So if you're looking at this sort of rebellious Gen Z Freudler phenomenon and saying it's totally new, it ain't. And Thoughts for Young Men is a great resource to show that it's the same problem that's been happening with young men for generations that he addressed back then. Only now, during Will's era, you had to work to find your way into some sort of cult underworld. You had to be part of some mystery school. You had to be discipled by someone because the internet didn't exist. Now you can go find all of this information on the internet just a couple clicks away. I myself was part of an occult mystery school. Sorry if you can hear that bend in the background and in and out. Okay, great. It's like heater just kicked on. I was part of an occult mystery school. We can share that story another time, where I was receiving, I've applied online. I was receiving straight up occultism lessons in the mail for 2 years, an envelope full of them. And I studied them quite hard. Kabbalism, tarot, stuff like that. So now those ideas are just kind of out there. So the internet has allowed that, just as it's allowed good ideas to proliferate, I'm sure many of us have been blessed by the ministries of pick your favorite evangelical creator, or like Joel Beakey, or whether you like Doug Wilson, or whether you like John Piper. There's plenty of countless others. Those ideas have been able to proliferate. R.C. Sproul, bad ideas have been able to proliferate as well. And then young men who aren't necessarily today willing to submit to older masculine authority because they feel they've been abandoned, they're going to go into the dark corners of the internet and be seduced by very bad ideas that present themselves one way, but inside are actually promoting something very, very different. So again, I chose Black Sun because it was my realization that things that I had been seeing online, including on Instagram, there was a reel, I wish I could find it. There was a reel of something that we'll talk about later called Esoteric Hitlerism. It's images of Adolf Hitler, swastikas, UFOs, big ziggurat pyramids, Atlantis. It was a very strange amalgamation of different images that was put together. And I thought it was very weird. In fact, actually, if you want to see an example of this, you can go to X and you can look up the account Radfem Hitler. Radfem Hitler, that's actually her name. Radical Feminist Hitler. And I can't remember her handle right now. But if you look at Radfem Hitler and you look at her avatar, her profile picture, at least at the time, I have no idea what it'll look like when you hear this. It's sort of an image of this mystical kind of Aryan woman, right? With, kind of this soft kind of new agey kind of colors. That is an example of esoteric Hitlerism. It's taking mystical kind of imagery and fusing it with Nazi imagery. I had seen stuff like that for years. It wasn't stuff that I shared, but it would come up on the feed from time to time, particularly in the manosphere. And I thought it was very bizarre. I just thought it was some young man's fever dreams. Well, I come to find out in reading Black Sun that once you start talking about Wilhelm Landing, that esoteric Hitlerism, and Miguel Serrano as well, esoteric Hitlerism is its own thing. And so there are people who are on the internet now who create content about this stuff. You don't know what it is, but you're looking at an ideology propagating itself through symbols via digital means. But because we're so inundated with Eastern mystical chakras, yoga, karma, meditation, all that, we can't recognize this for the darker cousin or sibling of those ideas. Now, once again, Black Sun, I hope, will reveal to you what is going on in a way that you will be able to recognize it when you see it. That when you spot either the language or the ideas or the symbolism, in people's profile pictures and people's X accounts, or just a reel that you happen to see or talking about Agartha and stuff like that. In fact, there was a reel that was very, very popular 2-3 weeks ago about white boys in Agartha, right? That was very subtly borrowing some of those same ideas. Antarctica, military bases, Nazi military bases in Antarctica. That's all talked about here in Black Sun. And so this will hopefully show you ideas that seem fringe or that seem new or that seem like it's some sort of joke. It's not fringe. There's a much larger movement that's been propagating this stuff now for 70 or 80 years. It's nothing new. It's not a joke. It's definitely not a joke. They are propagating a worldview and ideas through symbols And the curiosity about those symbols leads into very, very dark, explicitly antichrist places. Not necessarily right away. They don't hit you, welcome to our chat group, and now we are going to talk about Tantric occultism. That's not how it works. Men get seduced into clubs of men where they have conversations, and then like any other sorting, occult sort of like initiation process, the ones who seem most ready to receive the information progress further and are initiated into the back rooms. And again, we'll talk about William Luther Pierce in just a moment in his book, The Turner Diaries. William Luther Pierce makes an appearance in the American Neo-Nazism chapter. I wrote about the Turner Diaries in my Christ Over All article. In the Turner Diaries, that same process happens. There are the foot soldiers who are seeking to overturn the system, is what it's called. But then there are others who show proficiency that are then initiated into the deep mysteries. And as soon as I read that in the Turner Diaries, I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much more going on than people recognize. And so I'm grateful. Look, I wish we didn't have to talk about this. I wish I felt called to help you read Lord of the Rings or Beowulf, or you know what I mean, or the Ransom trilogy. Oh my goodness, Perilander was probably one of the most important books I've ever read in my life. Lord willing, we'll get there. But right now, we seem to be in this moment where something is happening on the American political right wing that we don't like. That is, if you're anything like me, you've seen it claim friends and family members, brothers in Christ. You've watched them leave churches. You've watched them end relationships. You've lost friends that I've lost at least 3 friends that I thought I was going to do life with. And it's been so deeply heartbreaking. And I'm not the only one. And so if you're looking at this and wondering what's going on, why is this man who I thought was a faithful brother in Christ, what's happening to him? Why is he bitter? Why is he angry? Why has he suddenly turned so radical? Why is he so worked up? I thought I knew this guy. It's because something antichrist has wrapped itself around his heart and is taking advantage of him and is dragging him off the gospel. The only thing that can do that is the spiritual force. The Black Sun will show you, Lord willing, will show you what some of those spiritual forces are. So let's get into it. I'm going to open to the introduction right now of the book. And just to show you, for those who are watching, this is the first page, second page. I made a bunch of notes getting ready for this, but I think it's all just right here. It was for me, just right here in the first 50 or so pages. I just want to read the first couple paragraphs so you can see what I'm talking about. This is the first paragraph of Black Sun, the introduction. The religious and mythic elements of German National Socialism often made the Third Reich resemble a cult in power. The pageantry of the Nazi rallies and their quasi-liturgical nature were matched by the extraordinary fervor of the huge crowds in attendance. Most participants were caught up in an intense atmosphere of collective excitement and self-surrender. Hitler's undoubted charisma and the assiduous development and cultivation of the Führer cult since the earliest years of the movement were crucial factors in the construction of Nazi religiosity. Huge congregations, banners, sacred flames, processions, and a style of popular and radical preaching, prayers and responses, memorials and funeral marches were all essential props for the cult of race and nation, the mission of Aryan Germany and victory over her enemies. The messianic figure of Adolf Hitler, the savior of Germany, towered over the entire project. And so as we think back, what I love about this book, what I love about Goodrick-Clarke's perspective is that he, through his own research into Nazi Germany, was able to see the Nazi movement for what it was, which was a religious revival. It was not a political, not solely political and cultural. It was religious and very often played on themes of Christianity, which we'll see as we get a little bit further into this chapter and later. So it was something that had in a religion has a life of its own. It's not just a set of beliefs or a set of contemporaneous political beliefs that expire when the moment passes. It's a religion that was explicitly created by the Nazis to fuse their imperial dreams. And so this is not something, when a religion is not created by men, I believe a religion gets created by demons and is given to men to develop. I don't think men can develop a religion on their own. I think it's something that has a spiritual life that comes down and takes people over. And Nazism was a part of that. Nazism was, in fact, probably one of the most powerful recent examples of that. So let me continue read this next paragraph. National Socialist ideology was also deeply imbued with ideas drawn from radical religious imagination. The belief in a Jewish world conspiracy, ostensibly backed by the notorious Invention, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, provided the image of a demonic enemy. Nazi anti-Semitism was rooted in this apocalyptic demonology, which blamed the Jews for all ills, including liberalism, communism, the corruption of morals, and the downfall of a traditional world. Does that sound familiar? Right? Remember, this is Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke writing in 2000, 25 years ago. The notion of national regeneration was also presented in the apocalyptic spirit. Only the destruction of the Jews could guarantee the salvation of Germany in a racially pure millennium. Alfred Rosenberg, the chief Nazi Party ideologue, was an early publicist of the protocols, establishing their core status in Nazi philosophy during the early 1920s. Dietrich Eckart, Hitler's mentor in Munich, held a Gnostic dualist view of the Jews and their antagonistic role in German national life. Hitler's own belief in a Jewish world conspiracy remained a lifelong conviction, finding terrible fulfillment in the Holocaust. The Jewish world conspiracy. This is the thing that many pastors, ministers, content creators, podcasters will not say explicitly. Some of them will. Some of them will. But they will claim a Jewish world conspiracy. They did not invent this idea. This idea came from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It informed the Nazi worldview, which then did not die after World War II. It continued on in America and Europe. The protocols continued to spread, continued to be deeply influential in many men's cultural, political, social lives. And the protocols are a fabrication. And as we get into this book a little bit later, we'll see how the fabrication was constructed. It's actually very interesting, like how something that was completely related to Napoleonic France was then repurposed for the Jews. So the fabricated status of the protocols has already been well established. But people are taking the protocols as if they're a real document describing real things, and they're basing their entire worldview on it. That's not new. It goes back 100 plus years or more. Dietrich Eckart, Hitler's mentor in Munich. Have you ever heard the name Dietrich Eckart before? You probably haven't. Nazi ecology will get into some of that. Of course, Nazi ecology from Mark Musser actually did get into a lot of that. Black Sun will touch on it at points, but definitely look up Dietrich Eckart, Eckart. Now, everything that I've read to you, that's literally page one. That's page one, right? So if you say, Will, I haven't done the reading, like I get it. Have you read one page, right? So if you've read one page of this book, you've already seen something that I think if you're at all plugged in on X, you've seen it express itself in various ways. That's, again, why I wanted to read this book, because we get further into it. I have a word highlighted here also on the first page. Traced in an earlier book, The Occult Roots of Nazism, I traced these ideas of racial election. And I think that idea of racial election is very, very powerful. It's not that a race is superior in any sense. It's that race is elect. And there's a theological aspect of that. And when we talk about sovereign election, God's sovereign election of individuals, the Nazis borrowed that idea from Protestantism, because they had the Reformation, and they applied it to their race. They applied it to the Aryan race. Where did they get that racial election from, though? It was not God's sovereign election of the Germans. That's not where they took it from. They borrowed the idea of racial election, but the reason why they were elect was because of their blood and their soil. The unique German lands that they were born from gave them that unique power. That's Nazi ecology by Mark Musser. He gets into that in depth, that the German land, like the actual soil itself, is what produced superior blood, which is what produced superior men. That was the Nazi ideology, deeply pagan, deeply occult, as I know that Mark Musser got into, and he and I spoke about that on the podcast. And also, of course, I know that Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke got into it as well. So continuing to page 2, I want to work slowly through these pages. Obviously, I won't read all 30 pages, but I want to highlight some of the things that I thought were important on page 2. There are occult notions of racial superiority combined with anti-Semitism and millenarian myths of national regeneration to find ultimate expression in the ideology of the National Socialist movement. Racial superiority combined with hatred of the Jews, so defining a destructive other, an enemy, and then millenarian myths of national regeneration. What is millenarian myths? The millennium, like when we talk about post-mill and pre-mill, that's the millennium. Millenarian myths is that they believed in a not a Nazi millennial Reich, the Third Reich, the Third Reign. This was a Nazi peace that was supposed to spread over the world. You may have heard Martyr Maid, Darryl Cooper. Darryl Cooper has notoriously said that Churchill was the real villain of World War II, and that, of course, is a complete lie. Churchill was the one who spotted what Hitler was originally about. It wasn't just expanding a little bit east and taking back German national lands. It was about expanding to a millenarian reign over the entire world. Churchill spotted that and felt like, hey, we need to do something about this. Only someone who was, deceptive could possibly claim that Hitler's only desire was just to take back formally once German lands. You don't need to build the military machine like the Nazis did in order to take back a few thousand square miles. They had much, much larger plans. But their plans were not just political, their plans were theological, occult theological. We're going to bring a Nazi Pax Romana, the Roman Empire. And this was a Nazi peace. And then the Man in the High Castle is I think an Amazon series that's a little bit about what if Germany had won. And you notice, what is that series about? This Nazi global reign, because that was what they actually want. Continuing on page 2, advanced industrial economy, they're absorbing ever larger levels of immigration, and their political commitment to multiracialism is now an article of faith. Today, the United States and most European nations are facing a demographic shift against their historic native stocks. The resulting issue of white identity recapitulates the dilemma of Austrian Germans fearing a loss of influence in the old Habsburg Empire. So Black Sun examines the survival and revival of Aryan racial ideas in response to the challenges of the post-war world. Post-war consensus, anybody? So there's a reason why these ideas, and Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke he actually acknowledges that the reason why these ideas, he does this in the introduction, the reason why these ideas continue to have purchase is there's still an unanswered question here. How are we going to deal with immigration and all of those? We don't really have a good answer, but in lieu of providing a good answer, these ideas the ideas of Black Sun have stepped into the breach. And so Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke acknowledges that in the introduction, saying that these questions do need to be answered, but in lieu of being able to provide good answers, bad answers have been allowed to proliferate. Continue also on page 2. This book explores the farther shores of right-wing extremist ideology. Actually, one sentence previous. Radical ideologies are feeding on the threats of economic globalization, affirmative action, and third world immigration. The book explores the farther shores of right-wing extremist ideology, Aryan cults, aristocratic paganism, anti-Semitic demonology, Eastern religion, and the occult supply underground beliefs to individuals and groups who fear a loss of status, cultural tradition, and identity in the emergent multicultural societies of the United States and Europe. It's just the first 2 pages. And you can perhaps understand why when I read these first 2 pages, I was like, maybe I need to read this whole book, which I did. I'm going to skip forward a little bit and just one more page on introduction, page 3. At the bottom of the first paragraph on the page, here the Jews are regarded as the architects of a multiracial world order, which supposedly dissolves all nations, traditions, and loyalties before the final accomplishment of Jewish world conquest. Right? These ideas are not new. And then continuing with the next page, the survival of anti-Semitism in a modern racist discourse predominantly concerned with opposition to ethnic groups highlights the enduring demonology of Nazism. Enduring demonology. This is not political in nature. Like Gnostics cut off from a transcendent deity in a benighted world, American and British neo-Nazis claim that Hitler and Nazism offer the only hope of racial survival to white nations populated with growing ethnic minorities. Anti-Semitism acts as a Manichaean dualist heresy, dividing the world into forces for good and evil. Aryan racial cleansing and the demonology of a Jewish world conspiracy are the defining moments of such neo-Nazi religiosity. And if you have been following the dialogue on X, you have seen conversations about ethno-nationalism, conversations about the Jews and Hindus and Blacks and immigrants. You have seen this. Why? And as I talked about in my Christ Over All article, the Jews behind a world conspiracy to propagate ethnic minorities to destroy the white race. That's what I talked about. No one has yet disputed that point. They focused on other things because that's exactly what's going on. Even if men don't recognize that that's what they're supporting when they're hanging out with their bros, that is what's going on. So just the only hope of racial survival to white nations populated with ethnic minorities Hitler and Nazism offer the only hope of racial survival. That's why the turn back to Nazism. So real quick, I want to do a quick overview of the overall trajectory. This is the trajectory that we'll talk about in the book. It's also, to some extent, the table of contents. So you have the early neo-Nazi and American movements of Lincoln Rockwell and Colin Jordan. They were closer to the Nazis, sort of like in terms of just politics and culture, very, very material kind of aspects. But then we move into Wilhelm Landig, which sort of revives this kind of Nazi mythology in some sensationalized kind of books that he wrote, and what we might call pulp. Then you get into Julius Evola. Just as an aside, when I called out Julius Evola on my X account, I believe it was back in June, my X account exploded with hatred from guys who were so angry at me because I mentioned the name of Julius Evola. Julius Evola, who there's a whole chapter about him in this book, is quietly a very significant influence in extremist right-wing politics that they don't want you to know about. And so this is in Black Sun, so you will see exactly who Julius Evola is. And for those of you who are active on X, I encourage you to do some posts about Julius Evola and see what happens, because they know, and I know as well, because I encountered him in the Manosphere, his work in the Manosphere, riding the tiger, I think, of Kali Yuga. His views are very, very central to a lot of people, but they don't want you to talk about what he was actually into. Then we get into probably the most, if you've read the introduction, you will see one name more than Adolf Hitler that's mentioned more than others, and that is Savitri Devi. Savitri Devi was a Greek woman, and there's an entire chapter about her that's going to blow your mind. She was the one who took ideas of German racial superiority, which is what Hitler and the Nazis were about, and took those ideas of German racial superiority and made it about white racial superiority. Because that wasn't originally what Adolf Hitler was about. There was no such thing as white people. There was the German race, which is what Hitler and the Nazis cared about. But white people as a broader category includes Brits, who Germany was at war with, the French, who Germany was also at war with. You have Belgians, you probably have Italians, Spaniards, etc., like Western Europeans in general. That is not what Adolf Hitler was about at all. He loved, quote unquote, loved, he abandoned, but he loved to German people. Savitri Devi was the one who said Adolf Hitler represents salvation to the entire white race, not just to the Germans. And it's a woman. So all these macho, manly, right-wing based bros, I'm sorry to tell you, but the ideas that you're saying about white racial survival, Adolf Hitler, etc., those came from a woman. You're welcome. Who went to India. Eat, pray, love. Anybody? And then we get into Miguel Serrano. Miguel Serrano is just peak weirdo. Dude absolutely looked like a vampire. Crazy. There are pictures in the book as well, and you can do your own research. So that's around the time that a lot of occult ideas started becoming fused with Nazism and more like Hindu occult ideas and Julius Evola more explicitly. So then you get into a phase where Nazism was kind of sensationalized. I've called this out before when talking about like the Nazis in popular Hollywood imagination. So Indiana Jones is a good example. You also have the figure of Red Skull in Marvel. There was a phase where a lot of the totalitarian aspects of the Nazis was stripped out, and they were mythologized and blown up into these big kind of like these villains. These I'm not sure the word. They're not quite comic villains, but these I can't really think of the word, but they stop being grounded in historical reality, and they more become like archetypes for the ultimate evil. And there's a way in which there's a kernel of truth on that you can hook these ideas onto. But when you do that, when they become ungrounded, when you take them off of the historical realities and paint them as this cosmic evil force, there's of course an aspect of that where you recognize the moral gravity of what the Nazis were doing, but it also makes it sort of like intoxicating in this kind of mystery. Like it's inviting you into this greater spiritual mystery. So there was a way in which using the Nazis as archetypal villains and separating them from who they actually were allows this myth to be propagated like a straw man, right? That a lot of like Holocaust denialism stuff now knocks down. So that happened in the 50s and 60s. We then this is all moving to the book, globalization then fuels rising liberalism, which then fuels an extremist nationalist reaction, which we're seeing. Then Nazism fuses with Christian identity, where it's that the Jews of Jesus' day were not the actual Jews. The actual Jews were white people. That's something that people actually believe. This continues to this day. And then you finally, at around 2000, when the book was written, you get into a notion of white racial statehood fueled by this version of Norse paganism. So you see this evolution of Nazi ideas from being focused on politics of Adolf Hitler and what he believed, this kind of mythic kind of figure, spiritualized, the spiritual Messiah ushering in this new age. And then the admission of pagan ideas finally comes in. And that total picture is a total picture of neo-Nazi ideology portrayed in Black Sun. What we're seeing today, 25 years later, has unique expression in right-wing Christian politics that also isn't new. But once you get a glimpse of the total picture of the neo-Nazi worldview, you'll understand that this is not a small thing. What we're seeing in our respective circles is one tentacle of a much larger octopus. That's what happened to me when I read the book. That's what prompted me to do that long introduction to my Mark Musser video. That's why a lot of people criticize me for changing my mind really quickly. Like, oh, he said this a month ago, and now I said this. Yeah, because I read this book that helped me realize what it was I had gotten mixed up in. And repentance is turning as quickly as you can and making good of an error. And so that's what I aspire to do. All glory due to God. So just continuing a little bit through the book. Let's see. Page 4, Evola, Savitri Devi, Miguel Serrano, Hinduism, Tantrism, Cult of Shiva, Kali Yuga. You get into that. You get another, page 4, another reevaluation of Nazism resulted from the demonization of Nazism and numerous thrillers and accounts of Nazi occultism published in sensational paperback editions during the 1960s and 70s. Here, Nazism was mystified and romanticized into a neo-Gnostic religion with links to Oriental mythology, secret Tibetan doctrines, and demonic inspiration. That's what I mean sort of about making them into archetypal evil. It mystifies and romanticizes them, which has a certain seductive power. This early section sort of is an overview of, its first few pages are an overview of the spectrum of the book. And just at the bottom of page 5, in the United States, the doctrine of Christian identity mixes motifs of heretical Christian dualism with a vicious theology of anti-Semitism, which regards Jews as the spawn of Satan. Perhaps you've seen that. African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and all other colored peoples are stigmatized as the mud races that are now diluting and destroying the Aryan race in its traditional white homelands. You've probably seen that in the Christian dialogue on X. And so just to conclude the introduction before we move into American neo-Nazism, the last page of page 6, the risks of racist religiosity are great. And again, I want this book to impress upon you the idea that Nazism, neo-Nazism is in fact a religion. Whatever Christian language it uses, it is in fact a religion. So the risks of racist religiosity are great. By projecting grievances, fears, and anxieties onto the, quote, shadow figures of other races, religious transcendence is stunted and perverted into the dynamics of exclusion and hatred. So instead of genuine spirituality, there is partiality, separation, restriction. And if you've lost friends to this, as I have, that is exactly what has happened. I've watched this happen step by step in men that I loved and cared about. By projecting grievances, fears, and anxieties onto shadow figures of other races, religious transcendence is stunted, meaning they lose their Christian faith and perverted into the dynamics of exclusion and hatred. You're seeing that in many high-profile churches. Instead of genuine spirituality, genuine Christian spirituality, there's partiality, separation, restriction. White separatist churches being set up in Tennessee, for example. A rigid self-righteousness leads down into the spiritual basement of a primitive dualism, where pseudo-salvation depends on the elimination of the other. The political projection of religious Manichaeism as in light and dark onto human differences inevitably leads to strife and violence. Whenever human groups are interpreted as absolute categories of good and evil, light and darkness, both the human community and humanity itself are diminished. Such degraded religion never leads to light, but only into darkness. And this is Goodrick-Clarke. My hope is that an understanding of the substitute faiths documented in these pages, together with their causes, can help us avoid the recurrence of past conflagration. So Goodrick-Clarke is trying to surface for those who are reading these substitute religions in order to make them evident to people so readers no longer get caught up in them and can recognize them for what they are. So thank you all for listening so far. I know I'm kind of monologuing a bit, We will get to a question and answer section in about 20 minutes. So quickly, we get to American neo-Nazism on page 7. The chief figure of American neo-Nazism in this early 1950s, 60s period is a man named George Lincoln Rockwell. George Lincoln Rockwell was featured in the White Boy Summer video that was shared by Eric Kahn, Brian Sylvain, and the members of Ogden Church. This video was made by Ethan Holden. That video circulated widely on X. I believe it was in the fall of 2024, so just over a year ago. We will see in these pages just who George Lincoln Rockwell was. And I don't believe the inclusion of that figure was just bros joking around. I don't think so at all. I think they knew exactly who George Lincoln Rockwell was, and you will see that he was a wicked, wicked man. But what's surprising is that George Lincoln Rockwell was a soldier. So you can see on page 8, Goodrick-Clarke says, a mixture of this is the top of page 8, a mixture of clowning and provocation characterized all of Rockwell's public appearances. He was the founder of the American Nazi Party in 1959. So 15 years after the fall of Nazi Germany, the American Nazi Party was founded. So we're not far from World War II when Nazism began to take root in America through Lincoln Rockwell. He had a partner in Britain called Colin Jordan, who we'll get into in the subsequent chapter after American neo-Nazism. So it wasn't long after World War II that Nazism found revival. But Rockwell and his men regularly picketed the White House with signs that read, "Save Ike from the Kikes," "The only communist party in the Middle East is Israel," "Gas red Jewish spies," and "Communism is Jewish." In 1961, Rockwell drove a hate bus through the South until his party was apprehended at New Orleans. The sides of the vehicle were hung with notices such as we do hate race mixing and "we hate Jew communism." And these are just some of the other ones. So a lot of the ideas that you're seeing people talk about today, not new. George Lincoln Rockwell, Ethan Holden, White Boy Summer, it's all right here on literally page 8. Page 8. We haven't even gotten into the book. Not even 3% into the book, and we're already seeing all the answers. So continuing on onto page 9, Rockwell became convinced that liberalism was the, quote, pimping little sister of communism. But Rockwell in 1941 had enlisted in the Naval Air Corps and won his wings. He served as a naval aviator flying anti-submarine missions in the South Atlantic and South Pacific. South Atlantic would have been against Nazi Germany, and South Pacific throughout World War II. He commanded naval air support at the Battle for Guadalcanal and during the invasion of Guam in August 1944. He was demobilized with the rank of lieutenant commander and several decorations in October 1945. So Lincoln Rockwell was fighting against the Nazis in World War II. He then got involved in the Korean conflict, and it says at the bottom of the second paragraph, Rockwell's involvement with the Korean conflict bred in him an enduring hatred of communism and a paranoid fear that it would undermine the United States. So then he got involved in the campaign to have the military hero, General Douglas MacArthur, elected president. And here's the weird part, bottom of page 9. An old lady in San Diego involved in the MacArthur campaign showed Lincoln Rockwell some newspapers that she claimed were controlled by Jews and out to smear both men. She introduced him to MacArthur's features and conned McGinley's anti-Semitic newspaper, Common Sense, which contains startling revelations of a secret Jewish communist plot behind the scenes of 20th century history. An old lady in San Diego. I thought that was very, very interesting. That it's largely men, but not just men. Like, can you imagine that conversation? Come here, son, have some cookies and some milk and an anti-Semitic newspaper. Okay. So then from there, we get into Gerald I.K. Smith, World Conspiracy. And then again, on page 10, Lincoln Rockwell goes into the San Diego Library. And the top of page 10, it says, down the dark book stacks of the San Diego Library one autumn day in 1950, Rockwell experienced illumination and political awakening. So this is 1950. He had always felt that the world was out of joint, that mischief was afoot, but now he felt he held the key to the past and the present. And how could he fight against this monstrous and universal plot? Given the apparent enormity of the Jewish Bull conspiracy, Rockwell now wondered why America had gone to war on the side of the communist Soviet Union and opposed, quote, Christian Germany, which never had a single highly placed spy in America and no plans for conquering the world. The example of Adolf Hitler and his crusade against world Jewry and communism quickly came to mind. Rockwell believed Hitler had understood the Jewish menace from the outside of his career, and that the Jews had involved Britain and America in the conflict for their own interests. This is exactly what men today believe. This is Daryl Cooper is laundering that Germany had identified the proper enemy. Churchill was in the pockets of that enemy, namely the Jews, and that poor Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany had it right all along. And you'll see this, people say this on X, Anons will say this on X. In later years, Lincoln Rockwell would write that, quote, future generations will look upon Adolf Hitler as the white savior of the 20th century and the Führer bunker in Berlin as the Alamo of the white race. Adolf Hitler was the last Christian prince. Sound familiar? So then you get into page 11. Lincoln Rockwell tried to advance politically. Rockwell was active among right-wing groups and attempted to launch an American Federation of Conservative Organizations that tried to advance by concealing his hardcore Nazi ideology behind a respectable front. But eventually he despaired of this strategy as it failed to attract dedicated racists and anti-Semites. So this is one of the problems that neo-Nazis and people who share these beliefs will face, is that they attempt to moderate their beliefs in public, they will get moderates to their side. They will get moderates to their side. It's only by being explicit about the things that they actually believe that they can attract the actual true believers. And so that's why you see these beliefs becoming more and more explicit in the dialogue, because that's how they attract the true believers that they need. That's the pattern, and it has been the pattern from the very beginning. Prompted by a series of recurrent dreams in the winter of 1957 and 58 that always ended with his meeting Hitler, the recurrent dreams, he decided to go public against what he perceived as Jewish power in America. He had some financial patronage. Then Lincoln Rockwell's team turns violent. The patronage, the funding is withdrawn. Here's another interesting part, bottom of page 11. Lincoln Rockwell's wife and children soon found the strain too great and returned to Iceland. His wife was Icelandic. I think that means that she divorced him. Deserted by his family and former supporters, Rockwell faced a bleak and solitary future in the early months of 1959. One cold March morning in his house at Arlington, he found himself alone, communing with a huge swastika banner and a plaque of Hitler. Communing with, like he's sitting in front of, meditating on it. Following another, quote, religious experience involving a brief state of universal awareness, he became convinced he had to fulfill Hitler's mission and a total global victory over the forces of tyranny and oppression. Universal awareness, that was explicitly a mystical term, a perception that all is one, which is an antichrist belief, monist, pantheist kind of belief. He had this experience of universal awareness, believed that he had to fulfill Hitler's mission and a total global victory over the forces of tyranny and oppression. So from the very beginning, Lincoln Rockwell was not just a political figure. He was embodying occult pagan ideas. That's who Lincoln Rockwell was in 1959. So again, this didn't just begin as some sort of like political kind of movement. It started with occult roots of universal awareness, quote, religious experience. Those are Lincoln Rockwell's words that Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke is talking about. So when I say that what we're up against is not just politics and culture, but religion, I mean it. And that will become more explicit as the years go on. From 1960 onwards, his brash and sensational exploits, page 12, were designed to achieve maximum press coverage for an otherwise crackpot fringe group that numbered no more than 200 members at its peak. These ideas are not popular. They're loud, they're boisterous, they're upfront, but they're not ever widely popular, which is part of what's going on with the brokers. I think, are they really as numerous as they pretend to be? I'm not sure that they are. There's so much more I can say. Bottom of page 12, Rockwell was convinced that Jews had promoted blacks into a hopeless position of alleged equality with whites. Deeply frustrated by their inability to compete in education and for jobs, blacks had become violent and thereby fulfilled Jewish plans for fomenting the breakdown of the traditional order and the advent of communism. Like you see this, and once it's like having a key to understand the coded language that men are using, and it's all here in the first 12 pages. Page 13, he was charged. He was arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, and stood trial in New York in June 1966, defended by a Jewish lawyer. Of course, Rockwell was acquitted through the court's upholding of the free speech he would deny to his enemies. World Union of National Socialists, Colin Jordan. This is the British arm, which we'll get to in the next chapter. And then we get to Dr. William Luther Pierce. This is the bottom of page 13. who wrote the Turner Diaries. I didn't know this. Pierce was a physicist by profession who had studied at Rice University and California Institute of Technology, Caltech, completed his doctorate at the University of Colorado, and then spent 3 years at Oregon State University. So, William Luther Pierce was a very educated man. This again, we start seeing, continue on page 14, The Lightning in the Sun by Savitri Devi, the Hindu Nordicist. I've never seen the word Nordicist before, whose Hitler cult and philosophy of history has exercised a deep influence on neo-Nazi intellectuals. So this is where Savitri Devi comes in. And this is where we start to get to a little bit into Lincoln Rockwell and some of the later voices. Pierce hoped that once, quote, once Aryan America has become racially self-conscious, has organized itself, flexed its muscles, and scented blood, the Jews will follow the Negroes into history's garbage pail in short order. Bottom of page 14, on 25th August 1967, Lincoln Rockwell was shot by a sniper's bullet as he reversed his vehicle out of a parking lot on leaving a laundromat in Arlington. The assassin was John Patler, who had edited Lincoln Rockwell's party bulletin, The Stormtrooper. Lincoln Rockwell had kicked him out of the party in March 1967, and then Lincoln Rockwell was assassinated by a member of his own side, which is tragically should say what's kind of going on there. These are the kind of people that are attracted to movements like this. They eat each other, and it devours itself. Then we start to get to a man named Matt Koehl, who he was successor of Lincoln Rockwell, Koehl. Matt Koehl begins fusing explicitly Christian imagery into neo-Nazism. Page 16, in 1968, Matt Koehl proclaimed the quote, Adolf Hitler is National Socialism, just as National Socialism is Adolf Hitler. So this is where you start to get the messianic images. And Koehl wrote of Nazi ideology as a creed and new faith. So again, this is not just politics. This is a religious belief. Matt Koehl again saying, our goal involves far more than the realization of some superficial political or social scheme. It entails a universal transformation of ideas and things, an upheaval of unprecedented magnitude. The national, again, Koehl quoted from a lengthy passage of Mein Kampf that claimed, so this is Hitler writing now, quote, the National Socialist philosophy of life corresponds to the innermost will of nature. Until at last the best of mankind, having achieved possession of this earth, will have a free path for activity in domains beyond. So this is the cult, activity in domains beyond this earth. This is where, and then going forward, Matt Koehl begins incorporating Christian liturgical practices and beliefs, repurposing them for the neo-Nazi worldview. So I want to read the New Order Creed. It's written just like the Apostles' Creed. It's on page 16 and 17. I don't want to give it voice. I don't want to read it out loud. So I will let you guys go ahead and read that. It's Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke calls it blasphemous substitution of Hitler for Jesus Christ, comes close to parody. Again, page 17, Savitri Devi is mentioned again. Savitri Devi says the words of the Bhagavad Gita, that ancient book of Aryan wisdom and insight. Quote, this is now Savitri Devi. Age after age, when justice is crushed, when evil reigns supreme, I come again. I am born on earth to save the world. Hindu, pagan, and Christian motifs. Adolf, so this is Koehl, now Koehl writing, Adolf Hitler was born on earth. He became flesh and blood. He fought and died. Now, this is getting into the 80s now, where you're beginning to see explicitly Christian religious imagery imported and repurposed for its own religion. Again, more Matt Koehl on page 17. And then when we get into page 18, I want to read this because I think it's important. Middle of page 18. For those who judge Hitler by the standards of his democratic opponents, Koehl asks, what kind of world did the victors of 1945 actually give us? Please listen to this carefully. What kind of world did the victors of 1945 actually give us? What is the cultural, political record of the Allies without Hitler after 50 years? Koehl sees a world of rat race consumerism, self-fixation, environmental devastation, pollution, and race mixing. Quote, this is now Koehl's writing. Quote, they altered the national demography and introduced us to integration, busing, affirmative action, minority quotas, sensitivity training, Black history, and the Holocaust. They gave us permissiveness, drugs, MTV, and teen suicide. They gave us safe sex and unsafe streets and gun control. They gave us rock and roll and rape counseling centers. They gave us alternative lifestyles, sodomy, AIDS, filth, perversion, chaos, crime, corruption, dumbing down, and insanity of every kind. End quote. This is Goodrick-Clarke. This overwhelming cultural pessimism is mobilized to indict the modern world as the last gasp of an old order following its temporary defeat of Hitler and National Socialism. This is page 18 in the print book. I want you to read that section again in your own time very carefully, because these same ideas are being promoted by Christian podcast hosts today. And you will see many anons saying, we actually lost World War II. That's what they will say, that the good guys were actually defeated and the bad guys won. This paragraph that I just read is communicating the exact same ideas. Men will say, in fact, Daryl Cooper, I believe, has actually said, if the bad guys had won World War II, it would look exactly like this, kind of making the point that ultimately anything would be better than the world that we've inherited. And that cynicism, that pessimism, is directly back to the earliest leaders of neo-Nazi ideology. So whether these guys know it or not, this is what they're actually parroting. And again, I've said it over and over again, these ideas are not new. And on page 19, you see the first mention of the Zog, Zionist occupation government, a current far-right epithet for the U.S. government as a Jewish-controlled puppet regime. That was James Mason, who I believe first popularized that term. Again, there are so many names that we can dig into. Once we get to page, we get to page 20. That's where we start to get to William Pierce. His status, this is Clarke, as the House intellectual of the original American Nazi Party leadership. Pierce, and then page 21, Pierce established his headquarters in Washington, D.C., and enjoyed extensive domestic contacts with the far right. Pierce is, again, further down on 21, Pierce's cosmotheism sees each race and species assigned a specific role in relation to the whole. Cosmotheism, again, it's a religious movement. Savitri Devi is quoted by Pierce also in the section just above. Let's see. As we're going through to page 22, we see a long description of the Turner Diaries, 1978. So just to give you a sense of the timing, World War II ended in 1945. Within 30 years, within 3 decades, William Pierce is writing the Turner Diaries. You can find the Turner Diaries online, but this book includes a description of it. Probably don't Google the Turner Diaries. You probably end up on yet another list. I do have a copy of it if you want it, because I wanted to see for myself. But it sort of talks about the plot of the Turner Diaries, where Earl Turner, it's sort of it's in the form of journal entries where he documents the organizations fighting against the system, which is run by Jews and minorities and stuff like that. And so it's sort of a fictionalization of trying to recruit people to bring down, the liberalism, globalism, the Jews, and all that. That's the Turner Diaries. It's like the granddaddy of hate kind of books. Protocols, Learned Elders of Zion, Turner Diaries are two. Like, if you want to understand, and Mein Kampf are probably 3 books that you can read. If you really want to dive into what people believe, it would be those 3. So I don't think we need to read through the summary of the Turner Diaries. I definitely recommend that you do that on your own. You'll see in the Turner Diaries on page 24, mention of Aryan communities of Eckhartsville and Wesselton, named for Hitler's mentor Dietrich Eckart and Nazi martyr Horst Wessel. So we don't hear the name Dietrich Eckart, but if he's important enough to be Hitler's mentor and to get a town named after him in the Turner Diaries, it would be worth looking into who Dietrich Eckart is to understand who Adolf Hitler was. Underground prophetic and religious aura of universal Nazism has brought the Turner Diaries an international underground readership. The book circulates widely among American and European neo-Nazi groups as a kind of modern Mein Kampf. And then we start getting into Robert J. Matthews. The reason why this is page 24, the reason why Robert J. Matthews matters is because he's connected with David Lane. David Lane, who drove the getaway car after the Berg murder. So in the page previously, Alan Berg, a Jewish radio presenter in Denver, known for his outspoken opposition to right-wing groups, was killed. Alan Berg was murdered. And then David Lane drove the getaway car. This is on page 25. Who is David Lane? David Lane drove the getaway car after Berg's murder, was an Christian identity church member, and also founded the 14-Word Press, whose motto has become a mantra for white identity groups across the world. We must, quote, these are the 14 words. We must secure the existence of our people and the future for white children. The 14 words were used on X by someone who is associated with New Founding and American Reformer. I believe Charles Haywood used those words. So these men know what they are talking about. It's not a joke. It's not casual. They may not know who David Lane is connected to. They may not know Alan Berg or Lincoln Rockwell, but they're borrowing language, specific words, language to talk about the future of the white race from the guy who drove the getaway car for a murder. I don't know. I wouldn't exactly put that on X. Again, William Luther Pierce popularized the idea that the U.S. government is a Jewish-controlled puppet regime, which has now become a staple of far-right racist discourse under the ZOG acronym. Timothy McVeigh had read Pierce's novel, The Turner Diaries. William Pierce's second novel, Hunter, which describes Oscar Yeager's one-man war against Jews and colored people, especially mixed-race couples. John Hinckley we're on page 26, had neo-Nazi affiliations. Richard Kelly Hoskins. And then the end of the book is very much about leaderless resistance. So the Turner Diaries is very much about how groups of individuals who don't communicate with each other can overturn complicated government systems. It's through leaderless resistance, which is a tactic that the left uses very well, that the right is using it also. And so the end of this chapter sort of focuses on that. Just closing with pages 28 and 29. The second half of page 29. American neo-Nazism has attempted to graft its own religious doctrine rooted in a dualist anti-Semitic demonology onto complex issues of Black desegregation and mass third world immigration, which continue to cause genuine social stress. Skipping ahead a paragraph, this critical distinction between the political circumstances of integration and anti-Semitic ideology helps explain why American neo-Nazism remains a separate phenomenon. The success of any neo-Nazi movement beyond its sectarian activities must involve the building of a wider base among alienated sections of white American society. So just to close that out, this is thankfully one of the challenges that neo-Nazism has faced. Is it's a sectarian, meaning a very quote unquote fringe, probably the more popular word, set of beliefs. How are those beliefs going to be marketed to a wider section of disaffected American society? I believe that effort has been underway through the Groyper 4chan movement. So rather than trying to reach men with families and responsibilities and jobs, it has now propagated either organically or inorganically, meaning there's a conscious strategy behind it, to disaffected young men on the internet through 4chan. You get them young. You get them when they're much younger, so you build that bridge much sooner, so they go into the world in their teens and 20s with radical ideas already. And so these ideas are pre-installed in the minds of men, so they go out into the world. That's why I believe these neo-Nazi groups have taken a particular interest in the internet and have fostered this online. Because that has always been the challenge of neo-Nazism, how to go from the fringe to not the mainstream, but to get as close to that as possible. That's why Nick Fuentes is dangerous. That's why Daryl Cooper is dangerous. That's why so many of these other people that have been on Tucker Carlson, especially, and Candace Owens and Ian Carroll as well, have been so dangerous, is they're building that pipeline from fringe beliefs into the mainstream. And that pipeline is now already established. And so I don't think there's any way to turn back that tide. Once you start allowing the sewage to flow into the main water supply, all you can do as an individual is you can begin putting a filter in your own mind to learn to spot these things and begin to push back and teach other people to do the same. So that's why I want to, again, just to close before we go into some questions, that's why I wanted to read this book, so that you can begin to spot these ideas and where they come from in the political dialogue, so you can be inoculated in a sense against them and begin to filter them out and help other people to do the same. So again, there's so much more. There's so much more I could go into with this. I've been reading a lot. I've been talking a lot, but I think it's really important to start out the journey well. And as we get into further additional chapters, I'll be reading substantially less and providing more of an overview. So thank you all for listening. And just in these last 10 or so minutes, I'm open to take questions from anyone who has them. So thank you all for listening. Go ahead and if you have any questions, please raise your hand or just kind of jump in. Oh, okay, cool. Go ahead.
Sure. Please hear me. Well, this is Jay. Thank you for the overview, first of all. Really appreciate it. It's like getting, it's increased my appetite and desire to read this in more detail, as you said.
Praise God.
Anecdotally, I think I've experienced similarly to you, people who have kind of left, maybe not like tragically as you experienced, lost a relationship, but I've seen people drift towards this.
Okay.
As you called it a religion, I have actually just a couple questions here. To me, a religion requires a kind of a view of the future and eschatology, right? Yeah. And it seems like even within this movement, there are different end states, right? Not like a or post-mill, but I mean, how do you think it's that well organized? Because that's a bit of a surprise to me. I'm coming at this as a complete neophyte. I don't really know much about this other than the fact that it's a deep, dark rabbit hole. And so understanding that you're calling it a religion, I'm not doubting it at all. I'm just saying it seems as though you would need that. And so I guess it's a binary question, right? Sort of yes, no. I guess the answer might probably yes, that there is a clear defined end state that they're working towards, correct?
Yes, I believe there is. There's a couple different levels, I think, to think about it. And it kind of depends on how religiously an individual takes it. So if you want to take it through a strictly religious lens, you can look at it and think of, like a millennial reign, meaning like a sort of spiritual transformation of the world. You can think of it in those terms. Or if you tend to be more material in your orientation, you can think of it strictly in terms of cultural and political terms. So in any movement like this, you're going to have people who are more, say, priestly, priest, prophet, they tend to think more in religious categories, spiritual categories, and you have people that think more in material categories. And so their end goal state is the same, which is the ascension of the white race to rule over all the nations of the world, right? And eliminating the Jews entirely, exterminating them entirely, and having white dominion over all of the so-called quote-unquote mud races, right? And you can look at that either as a dictatorial, totalitarian material reign, or you can look at it as a spiritual transcendence or transformation. Now, I don't know if most people, so if you say there are 100 men in the movement, there might be 5 to 10 that have thought through it that fully. Exactly. Most of them, yeah, exactly. But they have thought through it that fully. There are true believers of that magnitude that are part of this.
Yeah, it's strikingly so similar to what I've read in the Quran and the Hadith and Islam. It's very strange. I don't know, the connections that are happening for me in real time. Last question I have is, how does the book get into, or maybe you could touch upon how this relates to criminality or the criminal movement today or maybe in the past? Because I have some experience with folks in prison who kind of have these beliefs as well, that you might call them like people who are involved with gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood or Hell's Angels, that type of thing. Is there a connection there? Or is it a chicken or egg thing? Like, did that come first and this came around, or just curious?
No, I don't. I think it came later, because I think the worldview naturally leads one to criminality. Like if you really believed that Jews were the source of all evil, white people were superior, and everyone who is not you is some virgin of some sort of mud race, as in they're ontologically inferior to you. If you really believed that, then if you're just if you just were to ingest that and make it your worldview, naturally it would lead to a couple different things. One is hatred, targeted acts of persecution, but it would also lead to this idea that I can lie, cheat, or steal because they're subhumans, right? This is why, just as a parallel, this is why evolution leads to leads to mass murder. Because if you believe that evolution is a thing, that people are evolving, then some people are more evolved than others. If I am more evolved than you, you are a lesser life form than me. Therefore, you might as well just be cattle to me. So I think these ideas taken to the logical conclusion, the orthodoxy taken to the conclusion of orthopraxy, the belief taken into action, naturally leads to criminality. But then I think that these beliefs then flood into the prison system, and you have disaffected men looking for reasons. Disaffected men is not a new phenomenon. Looking for an enemy to blame it all on, and an excuse and an event for their bitterness. They bring into the prisons, and then the idea spread in prisons, because you do have explicit neo-Nazi white supremacist groups inside prisons. Just like you have Latino gangs and black gangs and stuff like that. It's and in some sense it propagates because it's a survival strategy, right, inside prisons. But I don't think it began in prisons. I think it began with criminally minded fringe men, and then it spread into prisons, which itself has become now a theater system for a lot of these ideas. I think that's the movie American History X. I think it's like Edward Norton's brother goes to prison and comes back and has a big swastika tattooed on his chest. I think what that's about. So I don't think it started in prisons. Lincoln Rockwell was a veteran. In fact, many of the early American neo-Nazis were in fact veterans of World War II in Korea. It was just that they got radicalized, doesn't quite capture it. They got possessed by a demonic ideology. Again, just to go back to what Lincoln Rockwell said of his own experience, a religious experience, universal awareness, these mystical sort of experiences of meditating on a swastika and a plaque of Hitler and getting this download. I mean, he wouldn't have used that word, but this download that I am the man to fulfill Hitler's mission. These are religious experiences. So this isn't just like I'm going to come up with a political strategy. It's that there is a messianic, prophetic, spirit to it from the get-go. And so whereas Lincoln Rockwell was more about that. And then again, if we get into Miguel Serrano, Savitri Devi, Julius Evola, it gets explicitly much more mystical. We're not there yet. But Lincoln Rockwell had these mystical experiences. William Luther Pierce sort of thinks out the entire eschatology, and how to bring it all about. And so he had the same vision. So if Lincoln Rockwell is probably more materially minded, political, social organizing tactics, William Luther Pierce is more, more mystically minded. You see those two have, but neither of them were criminals. William Pierce was a physicist from Caltech. Lincoln Rockwell was a decorated World War II veteran. And so it's not that these ideas only spread to quote unquote disaffected men. They spread to very capable men. And that's the real problem. It was only criminals. It was only fringe figures. It was only guys on the outside of society. I don't think this would have any purchase, but it's that it works its way into wicked men's hearts, takes them over and co-opts their gifts to propagate itself. That's why these ideas are viral and so dangerous. And I think why we're seeing otherwise competent, capable, intelligent men fall prey to them, because they always have, and they attract other men in their wake. And that's the real danger.
Right. Thank you for making my point. This is why this is such a great book study. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jay. I appreciate it. Any other questions from anyone who's here? You can put them into the chat if you're listening, or you can just jump on and ask away. Give a couple seconds here. Okay, great. Doesn't seem like
I had one thing. Well,
oh yeah, go ahead.
So like with my brother personally going through, all this stuff, I never really understood the obsession he had initially with like the Norse stuff, the Nordic stuff, and the obsession with his high IQ and his blood type and all that stuff. And then seeing him move into straight up like anti-Semitism, neo-Nazi stuff. Like I didn't understand where the connection was until I read this. Like he was on that pipeline for years. I don't even know if he even knew that.
That's right. Yeah. And that's the thing with this book is that if you, just to make it simple, let's think of it as linear. A guy starts out normal in various ways, and then the end of the pipeline could be a variety of different places. Maybe you're some political activist, or maybe you're into the deep Norse mystical occult stuff. William Luther Pierce, maybe you're in that level. That's the spectrum, right? A man can identify himself anywhere along that pipeline, right? He's not going to immediately jump. I mean, maybe he will jump into the Turner Diaries or some of them, or Savitri Devi or Julius Evola or whatever. But it's being on that path that, well, especially if you're in communities of other men, how does this work around other men? You find an idea, and like that's really interesting, and you go seeking out more information about it. You find your way in a community of men who talk about it, and then you get breadcrumbed along the way, right? And because these ideas are not just ideas, but they're spiritual in nature, there is a demonic, the word demonology is used over and over and over again. There's a demonic capacity. It starts changing a man's heart and character. And once that starts happening, it becomes very difficult to escape its grasp. And so I hate saying this, but I believe it to be true. It really takes the spiritual intervention of Christ to change a man's heart to get him out of this whirlpool, this vortex. As in, like, there needs to be something from the outside of the man that comes and acts on his life in a very powerful way to smack him and wake him up and pull him out of it. Because the pull is so strong once it takes over a man's mind. He starts seeing the world in a particular way. Once he starts seeing the world a particular way, he starts feeling a certain way about it. It wraps itself around his heart. Once he starts feeling a way about the world, he feels trapped and starts getting bitter. And the bitterness just sinks its talons in, and then he turns violent and angry and starts doing damage to his life. And then once you start doing damage in your life, you're isolated, you're separated from the people who care about you because you've hurt them. And then you're around other people who have done the same thing, and you are now separate from the body. And those salvation in Christ, repentance, that's all framed as weakness. It's all framed as like Jesus is this Jewish rabbi, right? Ultimately is where it gets to. Or, you don't actually pay attention to things like the fruits of the Spirit or Colossians 3 or sanctification, and it becomes a trap. And so you've isolated yourself from your friends and family. You're in a self-selected community. Sometimes it can turn to criminality. You've posted things online and your life is now a mess. And it requires real effort to get a man out of that pipeline, which is also spiritually seductive. It's a huge tragedy. It's a huge, huge tragedy. And myself and others who have lost friends and watch this happen online, people will say like, oh, this will blow over. And for a time I thought it would, but I think we're actually in some stage of a process of what this is going to do to the Christian church. And that's what makes me the most sad. But yeah, it becomes a totalizing worldview for men. Fewer women, women are less attracted to this. It becomes a totalizing worldview. And I don't know how to break an individual man out of it. It's like a cult. And my definition of a cult is any organization you are materially punished for leaving voluntarily. So you can join a bowling league, and if you tell the head of the bowling league, hey, I'm just going to leave the bowling league, and he's like, you shouldn't do that, or I'm going to leave some negative reviews on your, whatever your Google reviews for your business. You're materially punished for voluntarily leaving an organization. That's cult-like behavior. The same is true here. When you dissent from the tribes of bros, they punish you. That's what's been attempting to happen with me because I left the cult. And a lot of men don't have the strength to leave the cults. They've left marks behind. And so how do we get men out of it? I wish I knew. But the first step I know for a fact is arming ourselves with awareness of what's going on and then prayerfully addressing the individuals in our lives and then collectively with how to solve this. That's where I start. That's, again, why I think this book is important. Did you have anything you wanted to add on top of that?
No, I think that was pretty good.
Okay.
Thanks, man.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. Are there any other questions from anybody? Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up here, and I'll assign the next reading. This will be posted again for subscribers. I may also take the transcript and feed it into AI and produce a summary. If you want to read this, I'll see how I feel comfortable about that. So for the next section, I want to move slowly. As I was talking before the recording, I want to move slowly through this book because I think the early stages are pretty important. Plus, it's a scholarly book, so it's pretty dense. So for the next one, let's plan to do the British Nazi Underground, Chapter 2, and Julius, Evola, and the Kali Yuga. So chapters 2 and 3. I want to focus on that. The British Nazi Underground might not quite seem so related to us, but the figure of Colin Jordan is actually important to understand as the European counterpart to Lincoln Rockwell. But I really want to focus on Julius Evola, because for right-wing politics, Julius Evola is a very popular figure. He's frequently cited in Manosphere writings. That's where I heard about him. And I want to drill into Julius Evola. And then from there, we'll get to Savitri Devi. And I think from that point, we can accelerate quite a bit and talk less about individuals and their words and more about worldviews and symbols and stuff like that. So the next assignment will be the chapters 2 and 3, the British Nazi Underground, and Julius Evola and the Kali Yuga. And thank you all for joining. I'm very grateful for you. I look forward to continuing this journey with you. All right. God bless.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me for the second edition of the Will Spencer Book Club. I am in glasses and casual mode right now, and I have Black Sun here, and I hope that you're enjoying reading this book as much as I am. Maybe enjoying is a weird word for the experience, but certainly there's a lot going on in the two chapters that we're going to be covering today that I think is relevant. For some of the things that we're facing on the right wing in American politics, as well as online, and also in some Christian circles. And we'll definitely get into that. So the two chapters that we're working on today are chapter 2, the British Nazi Underground, as well as Julius Evola and the Kali Yuga. I would say that we're going to spend the balance of time on the Julius Evola chapter because, let's just put it this way, he's a major weirdo. And what's strange about Evola, and we'll get into this as we do as we talk more about that chapter, what's strange is the appeal that he has on the right wing. And it's not just strange that he has the appeal on the right wing amongst pagans. And as we'll see, I mean, it's like Bronze Age Pervert, if you know that name. It's like Bronze Age Pervert just ripped off Evola word for word. I'm pretty sure that's what, after having read this chapter again a second time, you'll see as we go through the chapter that I actually made notes about terminology that Bronze Age Pervert came up with and others around him came up with, basically describing Julius Evola's worldview when they laundered it and recycled it for a new age, for the frogs, as they say, or the 4chan denizens. And so you'll see that not only is Evola having influence on the right wing, but I know for a fact that there are a couple Christian influencers who got very upset when I mentioned Evola's name negatively on X this past June. I'm happy to name one in particular who got very upset at me. And so that shows just how far Evola's ideas have traveled. And if you read this book, which I hope you will, or this chapter, which I hope you will do, you'll see just how bad his ideas are. Just how bad and just how dark and just how genuinely evil and antichrist they are. So that these ideas are being parroted by a right-wing Christian influencer is pretty troubling, and we'll see that. But to get started, before we get to that, I want to focus on the British Nazi Underground. So if you're in the print version of the book, we're in page 30. And so I'm just going to read the first paragraph and then of this chapter, and then we'll just jump right into it. So starting on page 30, the total defeat of the Axis powers in 1945 and the confirmation of Nazi atrocities in the concentration camps did not delay for long the reemergence of a fascist tradition in Europe. Following the first post-war gathering of various European neo-fascist and neo-Nazi movements at Rome in March 1950, about 100 delegates from parties in Germany, Italy, Austria, France, Spain, and Sweden assembled in May 1951 at Malmö in southern Sweden. Within a decade, the larger neo-fascist parties in Europe were moving toward a new international, and the National European Party toward the new international, and the National European Party was founded by a convention of Sir Oswald Mosley's Union movement, the Deutsche Reich Party, June Europe, and the Movimento Sociale Italiano at Venice in March 1962. So Nazis were defeated in 1945. As soon as 5 years later, neo-Nazi movements were gathering in Rome. And in May 1951, there was a cross-continental gathering of fascists in Malmö in southern Sweden, from Germany, Italy, Austria, France, Spain, and Sweden. So within 6 years of the total defeat and repudiation of German fascism and Italian fascism, and Japanese as well, fascists were already gathering. Like like the explosions hadn't yet stopped ringing. The Europe was still covered in rubble. The rubble was still bouncing, and they're gathering to reignite the spirit of fascism. But, and we'll continue to the second paragraph, the post-war fascist internationals were generally careful to distance themselves from their wartime legacy and sought to avoid any embarrassing references to Hitler, the SS, Nazism, and the Holocaust. So, and this is quite odd because, well, real fascism has never been tried. I think you might say, and I think the thing that this speaks to is the irrationality of the worldview, as in you've just watched your leaders be just demolished, decimated by the United States, Britain, and Russia. Adolf Hitler committed suicide quite famously, and you watch the entire ideology crumble. And in the ashes of that, like, well, let's try again, but let's not mention that we lost. And so that's a little hard to understand. But what you'll see as a continuing pattern throughout this is there's an attempt to resurrect fascism, but they want to separate it from the Nazi legacy, the actual legacy of the Nazis, as in what actually happened, who they were, what they did, and what they believed. And so this is a strange tension that you're now going to start to see develop throughout the book, is what do we do with this historical reality of what happened? And we saw this a little bit with Lincoln Rockwell, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of his associate, who was less comfortable, but Lincoln Rockwell was praying in front of a swastika and had a cosmic vision, as if you'll recall from our previous discussion. So he fully threw himself into the Nazi imagery, believing in a Nazi revival. What we see also in this chapter is Colin Jordan, who is the British version of Lincoln Rockwell, who throws himself explicitly into Nazi imagery. So you can see, in moving into the second paragraph, still on page 30, such caution was completely cast aside. And this is the caution in referencing Nazi Germany. For the first time since the war, in the spring of 1962, by Colin Jordan, the British neo-Nazi leader who admired Hitler and revived all the Nazi props of brown shirts, breeches, and jackboots, swastika armbands, together with the slogans of Sieg Heil, Juden raus, and the Horst Wessel song. Together with Lincoln Rockwell, Savitri Devi, who we're going to get into in future chapters, Bruno Ludke, and others representing Nazi groups in 7 countries, he founded the World Union of National Socialists as a self-proclaimed Nazi international in August 1962. And now we'll continue into some of the deeper parts of the chapter, which is relevant to people today. Colin Jordan's British neo-Nazism was a radical reaction to the presence of a colored population. Does this sound familiar? While the American Nazis were protesting the emancipation of a Negro underclass in the United States, the British protest was directed at the rapid growth of colored immigration from the new Commonwealth countries beginning in the late 1950s. And so this is a theme that we're going to see develop throughout British neo-Nazism and American neo-Nazism, and probably also European as well. The presence of colored immigrants into these countries inspired this sort of neo-Nazi fascism. And one thing to keep in mind, the numbers of immigrants back then were significantly lower than they are today. So today we're talking about millions crossing the border or millions being imported into Europe. And that is certainly a subject worthy of discussion. And I think that trend needs to be reversed and reversed quickly. But at the time, we're talking about tens of thousands. And the mere presence of tens of thousands of colored immigrants and populations of millions was enough to inspire a neo-Nazi fascist reaction. And so what I want to really emphasize is that a lot of people are trying to say we need to listen to these grievances of the young men and we really need to hear them out. There is an extent to which that's true, but there is also an extent to which this is reactionary politics. It's a response, it is reactionary politics, where the mere presence of someone who looks different, who has different beliefs, as a vast, vast, vast minority is enough to inspire a Nazi reaction, right? As in, there are 10,000 people here, we need to go back to Hitler. That was happening 50, 60 years ago. And so to some extent, while we, yes, of course, hear out the grievances, but understand there is a point at which the grievances are not responsive to rational facts. They weren't back then, and they won't be today either in a much more difficult situation. So on page 32, Jordan argued that the struggle between communism and Zionism was an internal Jewish feud over the best way to achieve world domination. So again, this was what the Nazis and Hitler said about themselves. It was a contest between Jewish power in the East and Jewish power in the West, and all of that. The struggle of Jewish world power is another theme amongst Colin Jordan's neo-Nazism. Again, we're talking about Mosley. Mosley's first wife had suspicious that Mosley's first wife had Jewish ancestry. Least calls Mosley a kosher fascist, a Jewish agent planted to discredit the notion of fascism in Britain. So the reason why I bring that up is within these sectarian groups, accusations of suspicion are rampant. And this is the sin darkened mind that's fleeing when no one pursues. That's what's going on in a lot of these. So in his first book, we're talking now about Arnold Spencer Lessig on page 32. In his first post-war book, The Jewish War of Survival, Lessig conceded that the Jews had won a victory with the defeat of Hitler, but he argued that a vigorous policy of anti-Semitism could still break their power. He believed that Jews were encouraging colored immigration to dilute Britain's racial stock so that the Aryan civilization could be destroyed. While he credited the Aryans with creating all of civilization, he saw the Negroes as the most inferior type of human being. Like Hitler, Lessig regarded the Jews as an anti-race and infernal opponent of Aryan mankind. So this is 1945. This is Arnold Spencer Lessig is writing this book in 1945. So lest you think that some of the ideas that we're seeing are new, they're not. These are very, very old ideas that began developing as soon as the war ended. Right away, there was no gap. This is not a response to the so-called post-war consensus. The post-war consensus hadn't even been established yet. Europe was still a smoking pile of rubble when people were talking about Jews regarded as an anti-race and Jews encouraging colored immigration to dilute Britain's racial stock. This was in 1945, maybe 1947 when this is happening. So don't listen to anyone tell you, oh, this is just young men reacting to circumstances. It's not. It's something much older and much darker, which is the point that I've been making. Okay, page 33. The post-war shortage of labor in the economies of Western Europe had been met by importing workers from other countries. So many Brits, as well as Americans, are going off to fight in war that they had to import workers. Seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do. Unfortunately, that was also the cause of feminism in the United States, but that's another conversation. In Britain's case, they typically came from its colonies or former colonies, especially the West Indies, India, and Pakistan. The first group from the West Indies arrived in 1948, and from that year to 1954, some 8,000 to 10,000 immigrants came into Britain each year. In 1954 and 1955, immigration from the West Indies rose to more than 20,000 each year. So we're still dealing with tens of thousands. A total of 132,000 colored immigrants from the Commonwealth arrived in Britain between 1955 and 1957, of whom 80,000 had come from the West Indies. And that inspired the National Labor Party, the White Defense League. And so going down to the bottom of page 33, colored immigration provided a new angle on old racist and Nazi ideas. In Colin Jordan's view, the great importance of the immigration issue was that it forced people to think in terms of race and thus become more receptive of his primarily anti-Semitic convictions. Right. Okay. So this is a really, really important point here, is that the notion of what it means to be white was not a thing. It's really never been a thing, because Russian is not the same as German, is not the same as Dutch, is not the same as British, is not the same as, Austrian, etc. Within Europe, all of these different people were considered what we call different races. They don't see themselves as being the same. They see themselves as being quite different. And if you don't believe me, just watch a EuroLeague football match, and you'll see some very, very heated displays of we'll say ethnic pride in defense of two nations that share a border. And if you had the two members standing next to each other, you probably couldn't tell the difference. So from a European perspective, white was not a thing. White has never been a thing, but it was immigration of this called colored immigration here that gave an opportunity for a lot of these neo-Nazi guys to begin attempting to force Europeans to homogenize themselves into a concept of white. And that effort is still ongoing today. You will see conversations about igniting a white racial consciousness in response to colored immigration. And so white isn't a thing that's being attempted to invent. That's what a lot of this propaganda is about, getting white men to see themselves as some singular thing instead of a bunch of different things. That effort is still ongoing today. So we'll skip ahead. We'll skip ahead to page 34 with talking about immigration. This is where you'll see the mention of the Spearhead. Spearhead is, I believe, still an organization that's going. There are websites called the Spearhead, and that's what it goes back to. Again, it goes back to the 1950s. In the middle of page 34 towards the bottom, Bean and Fontaine clearly saw that Jordan's chief motivation was his admiration for Nazi Germany, whose example he wanted to translate, together with all the paraphernalia of swastikas, uniforms, and Hitler cult into contemporary Britain. In their view, this was a huge political liability, as Britain had paid dearly in material and human sacrifice in the Second World War. Ironic, right? Let's have a neo-Nazi revival in the country that almost died defeating him. No sense of irony detected. So then we'll go into some of the factions that began to develop. This is one of the aspects of this book that's kind of difficult, is there are so many different factions that are all quite small in terms of their influence. Lots of acronyms, lots of little groups, none of which really amount to more than a few hundred people, but they have significance in the story. Page 35, you have Tyndall became an avid reader of A.K. Chesterton's Candor magazine, which was devoted to Jewish conspiracy theory. 1954, Jordan started the National Socialist movement and began to develop a British neo-Nazi party with all the trappings of Hitlerism. He launched the party in 1962, and he got a phone call from George Lincoln Rockwell, the leader of the American Nazi Party. Racial nationalism and the glorification of German National Socialism were distinctive features of Jordan's NSM, the National Socialist Movement, that repeatedly seized the tabloid headlines. So grabbing tabloid headlines is not a new phenomenon. And this is a rally in Trafalgar Square. Quote, this is Colin Jordan. More and more people every day are opening their eyes and coming to see that Hitler was right. They're coming to see that our real enemies, the people we should have fought, were not Hitler and National Socialists of Germany, but world Jewry and its associates in this country. 1962. None of this is new. This was 63 years ago. World Jewry talking about, Hitler was right. So again, this is why I wanted to read this book. Unfortunately, in the next paragraph, this open avowal of Nazi sentiments were on page 36, and vicious anti-Semitism quite overshadowed the precipitating factor of colored immigration. And this is a tension that exists throughout these right-wing factions, is they want to push back on the political subjects that they find that they don't like, but they also want to celebrate Hitler. And so, and this factioneering, I just made up a word, occurs all throughout this chapter, where you see the tension on this extreme right between we have political things that we want to address and we want to venerate Hitler. If they address merely the political things, they might find more widespread support, just, find sympathies amongst sane and normal people. But as soon as they start saying, and we love Adolf Hitler and he was right, they lose all the normies. And so this is the trap that many on the extreme far right find themselves in. And this is also why the Zoomer appreciation for Hitler is actually relatively new, this mainstream Zoomer appreciation. It seems to be a generational thing. And the reason, again, why I want to read this book is that it's been cultivated over many decades until it could take root in this new generation. Bottom of page 36, Jordan's ambitions were global. By convening a gathering of foreign groups devoted to racism and anti-Semitism under National Socialist movement auspices, he sought to place himself at the head of an international Nazi movement. And so you can start to see men are starting to get ambitious. You see interactions with Lincoln Rockwell and Savitri Devi, who we're going to get into soon. A neo-Nazi international called the World Union of National Socialists was set up under the terms of the Cotswold Agreement, whereby Colin Jordan, Lincoln Rockwell, and the leaders of the other foreign nationalist parties formed a confederation. Page 37. The major objectives were defined as follows: to form a monolithic, combat-efficient international political apparatus to combat and utterly destroy the international Jew, communist, and Zionist apparatus of treason and subversion. 2, to protect and promote the Aryan race and its Western civilization, wherever its members may be on the globe and whatever their nationality may be. 3, to protect private property and free enterprise from communist class warfare. Long-term objectives included the unity of all white people and a national socialist world order with complete racial apartheid. So what's interesting about this is we've now gone from Nazi Germany, meaning the Germans, that's what Nazism is about, to suddenly it becomes about all white people. And that's a not a insignificant switch, that it goes from one particular ethnic group on the continent to white people all around the world. And that's Colin Jordan, who initiated that. Let's see. Paragraph 7 of the 25 paragraph, Koehl formally established the Nazi credentials of the World Union of National Socialists. Quote, "Nor organization or individual failing to acknowledge the spiritual leadership of Adolf Hitler and the fact that we are National Socialists shall be admitted to membership. Likewise, a long-term objective to find, quote, to find and accomplish a just and final settlement of the Jewish problem." And so Jordan was elected Führer, and Rockwell, his party and heir, by 27 delegates who with their parties became founding members of the World Union of National Socialists. Lincoln Rockwell and Colin Jordan were allies. And then we get into page 39. Jordan was talking about National Socialism survived the defeat of the Third Reich and its subsequent vilification because it was synonymous with higher man's will to survive, his instinct for health and strength, and his desire for beauty and life. And we're going to see, and we'll also see here, spirit against the structure of thought of liberalism and democracy with its cash nexus, its excessive individualism, its view of man as a folkness, interchangeable unit of world population, its spiritual justification, and a debased Christianity embracing a sickly humanitarianism. This is Colin Jordan speaking out against Christianity. We're going to see more of this with Evola. Let's see. Then we start getting into sections with violence. And this is ultimately the big problem, is that none of these ideas maintain are inert. The people who start absorbing these ideas, they don't just stay neutral. They don't stay like, oh, I've read all this literature and all this periodicals, and I'm marching in rallies and I'm hanging around these people. It inevitably leads to violence. That is the universal testimony of all of this, is violence being conducted against individuals, people going to prison, and militant action taking place. Page 42, towards the bottom, Jordan exalted Nazism as a religion of life and nature, quite incompatible with Christianity. National Socialists, he concluded, were neither nationalists nor conservatives, but racial revolutionaries summoning the white peoples of the world to unite for survival and supremacy. And so when you kind of start to say when people say Hitler was the Christian prince, it seems that those closest to Hitler in terms of time missed the fact that he was a Christian prince. It's very hard to start a Nazi party and say it's incompatible with Christianity when you look back at the men that you admire and they were all Christians. Somehow, I guess you must have just missed that obvious fact, or they're never Christians to begin with. Lionization of Hitler follows, page 44. Combat 18. I mention this because the number 18 refers to the letters A and H, or Adolf Hitler. So sometimes in neo-Nazi and adjacent communities online, when you see the number 18, that's what it references. Let's see. Moving on to page 45. American Nazi model, middle of the page, was evident in reference to the Aryan militant group, unexpected attacks with knife and gun, and the injunction to hide in the faceless hordes of Zog's putrid, mud-infested cities, undermine, demoralize, destroy. This is now into the 1990s. Then you see Zyklon B, over 6 million satisfied customers. And so there's much more in this chapter. I do want to read more in Evola and save time for that. You can read on page 46. A couple magazines, quote, reflect the frustration and rage of white working class youths displaced in their traditional neighborhoods by growing racial minorities. Right. So this is a real thing, and this is where Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke says like that these concerns are understandable to some degree. Like, but again, I want to emphasize this is still nothing new. And the reason why I'm reading this book, now, I think it's important, is I want to demonstrate the continuity of the concerns, and ultimately how political radicalism fails to substantially address them. And we'll get to. I want to skip ahead to. To Julius Evola, because this is when things kind of start to get weird, and what I think is really important. And there's much more to read about the British Nazi underground, but just to that point about political radicalism undermining its own efforts. And so imagine you have a bunch of young guys who are upset about minorities moving into their neighborhoods, taking their jobs, all of these concerns. If the response is to just become a Nazi, like as in literally a Nazi, as in to hang up a swastika and say Hitler was right and talk about Zog and mud-infested cities, if that's your response to these political changes, you have just kneecapped your own ability to create change in those situations, right? It was this radical response that allowed them to be dismissed as crazies. That's what happened. You look at this, it's like, wow, I kind of agree with what you're saying, but wow, you worship Adolf Hitler? Maybe you're crazy and there's no one else giving voice to these issues, so I'm just going to walk away. And so this is why this neo-Nazi project is ultimately so self-defeating, is that they have one choice. And we're going to see this in a second with Evola. They have one choice, which is violence and to ignite a global conflagration that consumes them and their enemies in one fell swoop, because they are ultimately marginalized. They marginalize themselves. And this is why the Turner Diaries, which we read about in the last chapter, was such a fever dream fantasy. Like all the white people are going to suddenly rise up in frustration all at once and work together to subvert the system of all the minorities and the Jews. The reason why they have to project those fantasies is because they have been marginalized, and they marginalize themselves. Rather than devotedly working to change from within the system, they place themselves onto the fringes, then they can be dismissed. And when they are dismissed and ignored, then what do? You turn to violence. And that violence either shows up in terms of like gangs conducting actual violence. We saw last week that William Lane, the author of the 14 Words, he was sent to prison where he died because he was driving the getaway car for a murder. And that's what all this ultimately leads to, is that men marginalize themselves and then they strike out in violence because it's the only way that they can get their political project moving. But that doesn't work either. And so this is why it's so important to de-radicalize young men, and not just now, but going forward, and to keep them invested in long-term participation so they can move the needle. As Eugene Peterson says, long, slow obedience in the same direction. It's the title of his book. That's Christian faithfulness, that you bloom where you're planted and you don't give in to radical claims, which ultimately express themselves in violence. And that's why we're reading this book, is so that we can help spot it and work with the young men to see that what has infected them is not new and unique to them. It's something that is much, much older. And even though this book is dense and there's a lot of names, and it's not necessarily an enjoyable read in terms of like, oh, it's such pleasurable writing, what a delight to read, I still think it's important. And just real quick on page 50, David Myatt, who we're going to see later, his National Socialist Movement, NSM, absorbed many C-18 activists when Charlie's younger brother Steve and a few supporters joined the NSM in March 1997. David Myatt had begun elaborating a religion of National Socialism in the early 1990s, advertising his writings in The Oak, edited by John Cato, advocating direct action and sabotage of basic services, including water, sewage, and electricity. Myatt saw C-18 as the street army from which an Aryan revolutionary movement could be built. Myatt's cultic view of Nazism embraced a Manichaean view of the racial struggle between Aryans and the growing number of colored groups in British cities. Quote, this is now quoting Myatt, "Since these foreigners are an invasion force, since there is now a war, and since we do live under a tyrannical Zionist occupation government, we have no choice but to actively fight for our freedom, our race, and our lands. We must fight the non-Aryan invaders who have settled in our lands." early 1990s, 30 years ago, before the Generation Z was even born. None of this is new. None of this is new. And I would imagine it's even worse in Britain right now, given their situation. So now let's switch to Julius Evola and the Kali Yuga. I spent a little bit more time on that than I expected to, but we'll try not to rip through this. What's interesting about Julius Evola, in addition to his appeal to masculinity influencers on the right, and apparently also Christian masculinity influencers on the right, is this is the first time that occultic spirituality gets fused with Nazism in a very, very powerful way. This is where things truly start to get weird. Like, not that it hasn't been weird before, but you can understand Nazism being a sort of, like, we'll call it a material political activity. We're going to concern ourselves with things on the boots on the ground, violence on the ground, ideas of world conquest, and veneration of Hitler as a man, right? Not some sort of like deity, but just as a man, as mistaken as that is. And, even Lincoln Rockwell having a moment of cosmic awareness, all of that is sort of understandable in a very small way. But once we get to Julius Evola, that is where Nazism begins to be fused with Eastern mysticism, occultism, Tantra, and so much more. Like, I could literally read you this entire chapter. And the thing is, the case that I've been wanting to make, again, for reading this book, is to demonstrate that this is not just some sort of materialistic project, that it is a spirituality that is making a spiritual claim over men's parts. And it begins with Julius Evola. It doesn't end there. It continues with Miguel Serrano and Savitri Devi, who we'll get to, but it begins with Julius Evola. And it's a shame that this is the first chapter that does not appear in the free sample of the Kindle version. But nonetheless, for those of you who purchased this book, I hope it's worth a worthy purchase for you. So page 52. On 2 August 1980, Italian neo-fascist terrorists took center stage as public enemies, every bit as dangerous as extreme left-wing fanatics. So much explosions, 85 victims. The neo-fascist strategy of tension regarded such mayhem, horror, and disorder as a trigger for a pre-revolutionary situation. I literally just read that at the same perspective about Colin Jordan. A single name kept recurring in their investigations. His name was Julius Evola. Julius Evola became a cult figure. And going to the bottom of page 52, his esoteric elitism, here we go. Actually, I'll go back one sentence. His unqualified elitist posture and high-flown metaphysical critique of modernity attracted those who felt themselves profoundly alienated from the norms and values of liberal society. More importantly, his esoteric elitism and spiritual authoritarianism offered a sophisticated ideology to right-wing intellectuals who saw Anglo-American neo-Nazism as a crude creed with limited appeal. Now, what is that saying? It's saying that through Julius Evola and his esoteric elitism and his spiritual authoritarianism and his well-read and his monocle and his whole appearance, he could export some of the most destructive parts of the Nazi ideology, but remove it from some of the ideas, some of the approaches taken by Colin Jordan and Lincoln Rockwell. So these boots on the ground guys, these weren't good enough for a Julius Evola. He needed to take their ideas and give it a more high-minded, elite-friendly, perhaps even upper-class kind of vibe. And so, typical of the 1960s, he's taking those same ideas and he's fusing them with Eastern mysticism, which was quite popular at the time, and producing something very, very intense and very dark. Because at the top of page 53, Julius Evola is today a prominent icon of fascist idealism. His ideal was the Indo-Aryan tradition, where hierarchy, caste, authority, and state ruled supreme over the material aspects of life. Invoking the heroic and sacred values of this mythical tradition, Evola advanced a radical doctrine of anti-egalitarianism, anti-democracy, anti-liberalism, and anti-Semitism. He scorned the modern world of popular rule and bourgeois values, democracy and socialism, seeing capitalism and communism as twin aspects of the benighted reign of materialism. I mean, this is just, you can kind of see, just how much how much the benighted realm of materialism plays in, that he's able to say that our whole world is fallen, benighted world of materialism, and as a result, all these expressions of anti-egalitarianism, anti-democracy, anti-liberalism, and anti-Semitism. Page 53, beset by spiritual restlessness, he embarked on a quest for self-transcendence, which implied a break with the bourgeois values of the past. Moving, and again, we get to page 54. I've just highlighted basically all of those 2 pages. I'll try not to read them all. At the bottom of page 53, Evola's philosophical idealism of the absolute individual was but one expression of his quest for self-transcendence in a post-war age of shattered values and moral uncertainties. He also became interested in Oriental studies and became a profound student of magic, the occult, alchemy, and Eastern religions. He experimented with hallucinogenic drugs, discovered the ancient Theravadan Buddhist text, the Majjhima Nikaya, and wrote the introduction to an Italian translation of the Tao Te Ching. He frequented the Italian Independent Theosophical League, theosophy being Madame Blavatsky, and was introduced by its president, Decio Calvari, to the study of Tantras, which especially captured Evola's imagination. He began corresponding with Sir John Woodruff, the learned British Orientalist who revealed the secrets of this esoteric school in The Serpent of Power and other books published under a pseudonym, Arthur Avalon. Evola presented his own study of Tantrism and Kundalini Yoga based on Woodruff's works and original texts. So Tantra. What's Tantra? You've probably heard it referenced. You've probably heard like Sting, for example, the musician Sting. I think it's referenced in a Mike Myers movie. I can't remember which one. Maybe it's Austin Powers. Let's read this. Page 54. Tantrism revolves around the notion of breaking all ties or bonds, or pasha. Individuals with an animal nature, enslaved by appetite, lust, custom, and religious conformity, are necessarily disqualified. By means of taboo and spiritually dangerous practices, i.e. orgies, intoxication, the superior adept, or vira, can raise his consciousness to supreme levels of unity with the divine female power of Shakti, which animates and inspires the whole universe, thereby acquiring exceptional knowledge, or vidya, and magical powers, siddhis. Tantric doctrine lays much emphasis on the male god Shiva and his bride Shakti, whose sexual union is personified in ritual intercourse. While this act symbolizes the creative impulses of the cosmos, male ejaculation of semen is typically discouraged. In this way, the energy of orgasm is supposedly channeled away from the propagation of organic life toward a powerful ascent experience. So what's going on there? What's going on there is sex magic, where you can achieve supreme consciousness, acquiring exceptional knowledge, vidya, and magical powers, siddhis. The purpose of Tantra is to acquire magical powers and secret knowledge. That is what Tantra is. That's what it's for. And so when you hear people doing it, maybe not everyone's engaging in that. Maybe not everyone is aiming directly for that, but that's the purpose of the practice, and that's why elites do it. And so you can imagine that Julius Evola was engaging in quite a lot of this, and that led to his worldview. Let's go to the next paragraph on page 54. Tantrism complemented Western idealism in Evola's quest for self-transcendence. Its secrecy and elitism essentially negated the modern world of rationalism and democracy. Evola wrote that the knowledge and powers pursued by the modern world are democratic, that is available at educational institutions for anyone with enough intelligence. Likewise, technology is democratic. An instrument or weapon can be used by anyone with sufficient training. By contrast, the tantric magical powers, siddhis, are always personal and exceptional achievements accessible only to the few. Skipping ahead, the Indians sought a full-blooded embrace of life's delights, liberty within the world. Tantric rituals essentially transformed, quote, poison into medicine, end quote, for the strong and liberated individual. Poison into medicine. Things that are forbidden and off limits are actually good for you. That happens to be the ultimate meaning and purpose of Aleister Crowley saying, do as thou wilt. Same as Crowley, exactly identical. So when we talk about right-wing influencers being deeply influenced by Evola, we're talking about Bronze Age pervert, for example, this is where it all leads. I don't think that there's any cause for any Christian to be reading Evola at all, except for to know how to better burn the books in the fire. That's what's going on here. And there's no cause for Christian influencers to say, but he says some good things. He doesn't say any good things. He's a tantric sex magician. Absolutely, absolutely unacceptable. Sure, I can understand if men in the manosphere are super into it with their elite visions of themselves, but there's absolutely nothing that a Christian can get from reading this poison that should be edifying to them in the least. A Christian mind should be disgusted by what they're reading. Poison into medicine. Poison into medicine. What a terrifying idea. So going on to page 55, during the 1920s, Evola immersed himself in the study of Western esoteric tradition. Through theosophical and Masonic circles, he met Arturo Regini, a Roman occultist immersed in alchemy, magic, and theurgy. I don't even remember what theurgy is. Regini edited two journals, Atenor and Ignis, whose contents embraced initiate studies from Pythagoreanism to yoga, from Hebrew Kabbalism to Cagliostro's Egyptian Freemasonry. And he contributed articles on Tantras. Alchemy and Hermeticism. This is where you start to get at the bottom of page 55. Both he, I'm not sure who that's referring to, but Evola regarded the Roman patrician world and the imperial constitution as close approximation to their ideal state. The strict hierarchy was but a pattern of a higher, transcendent, and absolute order. The leveling, egalitarian universalism of Christianity negated and ultimately dissolved this political order, heralding the disorder of the modern world. So if you've been participating in any of the online masculinity discussions, you may have seen this return to Rome and this reevaluation of the Roman Empire as a return to pre-Christian modes of higher level civilization, right? That's what those movements are about. We need to discard Christianity because Christianity has produced a civilization of weakness. This is what they say, and we need to return to a higher realm of Rome, which features the spiritual elite. Page 56, Evola sought to transform fascism in accordance with his precepts of spiritual aristocracy and monarchy. These attacks reach a climax in the publication of his book Pagan Imperialism, in which he celebrated the ideal of ancient Rome, denounced all the Christian churches, and scourged the secular universalism of both American democracy and Soviet communism. Then he discovered the work of René Guénon, sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, Theosophy, Freemasonry, Advaita Vedanta, which was becoming better known in the West through Vivekananda. Vivekananda spoke at the Chicago World Parliament of Religions in 1893. This was organized by the Theosophical Society. I've been to Vivekananda's ashram in India. It was a big deal that he made it all the way to the United States. And all these world religions were brought together to speak, and this was the first time a Hindu guru had come to the United States. So, and his speech was quite popular. In fact, it was a very famous speech, and it may have initiated the move to Eastern mysticism in the United States long before the 1960s. We're talking about 1893. But in the Chicago World Parliament of Religions, guess what religion wasn't invited? Biblical Christianity. Fundamentalist biblical Christianity was not invited to participate in the Chicago World Parliament of Religions. I wonder what that means. Guénon described the ultimate reality according to Vedanta. Beyond all reason or discursive thought, this metaphysical unity can only be grasped from the inward-directed point of view, the super-rational intellectual intuition by which the self communicates with the ego. Guénon considered that Hindu Vedanta represented a, quote, primordial tradition whose transcendent truths were also preserved in the authentic religions of Islam and medieval Catholicism. And this is where we start to get into the Hindu Puranic divisions of time. On page 57, the four yugas, each of successively shorter duration, corresponded to the golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages of classical antiquity. The West had now been passing through the fourth age, the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age, for more than 6,000 years. Evola felt a deep affinity with Guénon's esoteric pessimism. Here in sparse outline, Evola found all the reasons for the decay of a primordial heroic world based on sacred authority and metaphysical absolutes. That's when he wrote Revolt Against the Modern World. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in here, and I want to just kind of talk about it rather than read it. So from Evola's worldview, there's turnings or ages. And you start with an age of high spiritual order that then decays through successive ages until you reach a Kali Yuga or Dark Age, after which everything collapses and then there's a rebirth. So history is not linear, it's cyclical. As part of these decaying ages, at the beginning, you have a spiritual elite The spiritual elite rule and reign, but progressively spiritual elitism, hierarchy, masculinity, all decay over the ages until you reach this feminine kind of collapse. So you have civilizational collapse, which parallels collapse of spiritual elitism, which parallels a collapse of masculine elitism towards the feminine, and the feminine leads to collapse. And so we see a lot of these ideas, and this is a transcendent theological process, meaning it's fixed. You can't change it. It's written into this. It's written into the stars. There's nothing you can do to reverse it. In this chapter of the book, it talks about how there was no evidence, because Darwin was of course quite popular at the time. There was no evidence for a higher civilization going back thousands of years. You don't find that in the fossil record, for example, which leads to a spiritualization. Oh, this is all before material reality, right? So you get this worldview that says, how did we get to this decaying civilization? Well, we must have started from a much higher state, but you know what? Like, there's no evidence for that. So it must be a much higher spiritual state. And so you see these layers of delusion taking place, probably driven by his tantric sex magic, that's forcing him to disconnect further and further into reality. But because he's an aristocrat, because he's very read and expresses himself well, and he has this mystical appeal to disaffected young men, they go following into the wilderness. And that has disastrous consequences, as talked about in the beginning of the book, where there was a bombing where 80 people died. And so, as I was talking about with Carl and Jordan, these ideas don't stay locked in the little box of your mind. These aren't trinkets that guys just toy around with. Ultimately, they must express themselves in action, because otherwise, what are you doing? You're just LARPing, right? And so what we see consistently is that these ideas of whether it be civilizational decline or mud people or Jewish world conspiracy motivate men to violent action that destroys their lives and the lives of others. That is why I call this a spiritual poison, because it destroys men. It destroys everything about them. It takes strong men and who could actually be some good in society. It poisons their hearts with bitterness. It drives them to madness and ultimately to violence that kills them and others. So in the same way that radical feminism is a wonderful tool to ruin otherwise good women, this neo-Nazism, there's no other word for it, is a tool to ruin men. It's a tool to ruin men. These are the ideas that I've been working with for the past year and a half, and I'm grateful to share them with you. Let's see. You can talk a little bit about the Dark Ages. Actually, at the end of 57, end of page 57, Evola's view of history and political theory were grounded in a fundamental, quote, doctrine of two natures. The, quote, primordial tradition, which distinguishes the metaphysical order of things from the physical, the immortal from the mortal world, the superior realm of being from the inferior realm of becoming, the dominant virile principle of spirit from the lower feminine domain of matter. This is Platonism. There's the Gnosticism. Ultimately, the world of matter is feminine. The world of higher ideas is masculine. Masculine is better than feminine. So we will aspire to transcend this material realm. It's cosmically misogynistic, and it's cosmically chauvinistic and arrogant for men, and it's also dualistic, meaning sort of like this dualism, this Gnosticism. Higher knowledge comes from above. There's so much more I can get into. If you get into page 59, you see Helena Blavatsky's Theosophy again. And what's so strange about this is, of course, the feminine is concerned with matter, but a lot of these pagan guys are super into these ideas, and they all come from Helena Blavatsky. Like who I mean, I don't think it's unfair to say that she looks like a hag, and I don't mean that in some sort of like epithet kind of way. I mean, like there's a witch kind of like hag appearance that word just used to be more of a descriptor, and that's kind of what she looks like. And so it's sort of like the ultimate anti-feminine, I guess it makes sense in a sense, has this appeal to the masculine. Again, you have the overcoming at the end of page 59. You have patriarchy overcoming matriarchy. Evola, this is the bottom of page 59. Evola adopted Bachofin's idea of matriarchy not as a prior linear phase of evolution, but as an independent southern world inhabited by other races that eventually clashed with the northern Atlantic traditions. This southern mother culture was later typified by the Asiatic Mediterranean goddesses of life, such as Isis, Ishtar, Cybele, and Demeter, who subordinate the male solar principle, and by images such as the child in the lap of the Great Mother. By contrast with the virile spirituality implicit in intelligible essences and dramatized in gods of war, sky, and the sun, the quote mothers preside over a telluric and chthonic world of earth, darkness, and moon. In accordance with the maternal principle in which we are all children of the earth, this culture encouraged social structures of a collectivist nature with ideals of sharing, brotherhood, and equality. Evola saw these lunar themes of peace and community as typical of Tantrism, representing the second Silver Age or Treta Yuga, in which a priestly caste ruled without virile regal authority. Anyway, I read all that because the word that is used to describe this today is called the Longhouse. So if you want to know where Bronze Age pervert got his idea of the Longhouse, he got it from Julius Evola. I will skip page 60 about women being a nullity. Man is a subject and woman is an object whose only desire is to be formed and given meaning by male attention and sexual coitus. And so that's Julius Evola's perspective on women. And this is, you also see Mithraism declining in Iran, page 60. Once Mithraism declined in Iran, Evola saw its later revival in the Roman Empire as a spiritual path that the West might have followed instead of Christianity, a speculation incidentally shared with Carl Gustav Jung. And then we get into his celebration of the Roman Empire, which he said was attempting to take history from the lunar world of the mother to the solar world of the fathers. This was all manosphere stuff in 2020 and 2021, especially during COVID. And just, the last paragraph that I want to read, man, I could just read so much of this. I've read so much of that. I've highlighted so much of this. Evola regarded, bottom of page 61, Evola regarded the advent of Christianity as a process of unprecedented decline. The Christian ideal of a religion open to everyone, irrespective of race, tradition, and caste, was a solvent of Roman order and hierarchy. By positing mere faith over heroic and initiatory spiritual growth, Christianity appealed to the plebeian mentality with promises of salvation from subjection, the world, and even death. Christian egalitarianism, based on principles of brotherhood, love, and collectivism, militated against all Roman ideals of duty, honor, and command. The Christian God was not the God of the patricians, invoked while standing erect and carried in front of the legions, but a crucified God-man to whom one prayed in the sense of sin and atonement. The spread of Christianity marked a shift from the masculine to the feminine, from the solar to the tellurian, from the martial aristocratic values to the mystical plebeian sentiment. So you can see what Evola thought of Christianity. Why Christian influencers are reading him or listening to him is beyond my understanding. He then gets into his appreciation for the German people. That's probably how Evola's ideas got fused with Nazism, even though he came around after Nazism. He talks about the influence of the Jews beginning on page 64, and which has a lot to do with banking and materialism as being dominant during the Kali Yuga. So his anti-Semitism is more tied to his hatred of the material world and seeing Jews as the calculating masters of the material world that needs to be overcome than it is anything specifically ethnic or racial in this kind of way. It's a more spiritualized conspiracy. Bottom of page 65, Evola follows Karl Marx and Werner Sombart in seeing a revival of the quote, Hebraic spirit in Protestant Puritanism, rationalism, and capitalism. Which is probably why he was a fan of Islam and Catholicism. The Jewish spirit, which destroys, this is Evola, quote, the Jewish spirit, which destroys everything through rationalism and calculation, leading to a world consisting of machines, things, and money instead of persons, traditions, and fatherlands. So maybe that gives some clue for why Evola is so popular, talking about tradition and fatherland and people as some sort of cosmic superior elite. These ideas are very, very infectious to men. So again, I just want to read one more section, and then we'll open it up for questions. Page 67. Evola's critique was scathing. Nothing in this final stage of the Kali Yuga was worthy of survival. Evola sets up the ideal of the, quote, active nihilist who is prepared to act with violence against modern decadence. And so this idea shows up in the phrase, enjoy the decline. So the three terms that I saw, and I think many people have seen in the manosphere that were inspired by Evola, were essentially the longhouse, which was coined by Bronze Age pervert who does a low rent Romanian version of Evola. So the longhouse, return to Rome, RETVRN, return, if you remember that, return to Rome, and enjoy the decline. These three ideas come directly from Evola in the mid 20th century, and these three ideas are formative for the manosphere. And if you've been watching my series with Bob the Baptist, you can see how the manosphere has flooded into Christian circles and bringing Evola, though not necessarily his name, though sometimes bringing Evola with them. And so in the final pages of Julius Evola and the Kali Yuga, you begin to see the influence and the violence that has been done by people in his name. Because if you believe that the decline is inevitable, and you believe there's that everything needs to be destroyed in order for a higher civilization to arise, are you just going to sit back and just enjoy the decline, truly enjoy it? Or are you going to be an accelerationist? Are you going to, as they say, immanentize the eschaton? Are you going to embrace violence and chaos to spark off a revolution, to collapse civilization so you can build your new utopia anew? This is the Turner Diaries. That's what this is about. That was Colin Jordan. That was Lincoln Rockwell. And that's Julius Evola, right? So we've now read 3 chapters, right? We just read, I think, the Julius Evola and the Kali Yuga is chapter 3. Yes. Okay. We've now read 3 chapters with three key figures, Lincoln Rockwell, Colin Jordan, and Julius Evola, to which I'll add the author of the Turner Diaries, all of whom are presenting the same idea. We need to destroy civilization so that the new state can rise. This sounds, I don't know, this sounds pretty Fabian socialist to me, right? That's what the Fabian socialists are about. Order out of chaos. That's also Freemasonic. Freemasonic is Antichrist in nature. And so you can see now, hopefully, that there is much more going on than just young men's grievances. We're looking at people who are actively campaigning for the destruction of civilization. And that is one thing, but young disaffected men are buying it, and they are ruining their lives, and they are dying and killing others in the process. It's destroying their families, it's destroying their hearts, and ultimately it's destroying their souls. And so just in these 70 pages, I hope that you can see so far the power of these ideas and the consequences of them. And thankfully, we haven't seen any street violence just yet, though certainly it has been talked about. And I know for a fact that there are influencers in Reformed Christian spheres, none of whom you would probably respect, who believe that igniting a race war is necessary. Someone actually gave me a name of someone who's produced a lot of meme content who actually believes in sparking a race war to bring down civilization and build the new era and return to Rome. So this is what's happening, and this is why I say this is a spiritual force that not only seeks to destroy men, but seeks to destroy civilization, and it has deeper roots than just the so-called post-war consensus. It goes back quite a bit further. Okay, so that's me doing a lot of talking. Thank you for listening. Open to any questions if anyone has them about this or any other content in the book. Well, if there are no questions, then I may just Oh, please go ahead. Go ahead, Jay.
Well, it's Jay. Sorry, I was
That's okay.
trying to figure out how to use Zoom. Couple questions.
Yeah.
That transition you talked about earlier from the revival of the German nation to a turn to some sort of worldwide reconquista. I have no idea what to call it. That seems a little bit strange, because what does one have to do with the other? That maybe you could help me fill in the dots there, or connect the dots. Mixing my metaphors here.
Yeah.
Is trying to understand how do you go from I'm a German, my mojo back,
therefore I'll elect Hitler and justify the means. Okay. But now the neo-Nazis seem to be using that to find and mobilize disaffected youth and create like anarchy, which is the opposite end of a organized socially democratic republic or national socialism. Do you see what I mean? It's like there's a disconnect in my head of trying to understand you want a better society that's run more efficiently, right? As
Yeah.
like a better nation state. But then you also have this pretty much, it seems like a return to brutalism.
Yeah.
And reading some of this book was just total violence kind of running amok. I don't know. I mean, this is my first time reading this and understanding a lot of this Evola material. So I'm just trying, if you could help clarify that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So there's a couple questions there. How do we go from a German ethnic particularism to a white man universalism? How did the idea make that jump from something that was located in a specific nation in Europe that was destroyed essentially to becoming something about white men more broadly? And then also, how do they connect the dots, I think, between we need to build this higher civilization, right, and return to this spiritual elitism, but the way we do it is through thuggish violence? Are those the two questions?
Yeah, I mean, like Turner Diaries is just filled with blood and gore. I mean, so
Yeah.
many people died. It's like the end of civilization. I mean, do they not realize that? I mean, I'm just maybe oversimplifying here. But I'm just,
No.
okay.
No, I mean
Go ahead.
you're right. Like there are a couple inherent contradictions, and so the idea that these men can build some sort of higher civilization through violence is ultimately, I mean, they know that there's a contradiction there, which is why their perspective is that what we have to do is we have to spark off this global wave of destruction, and out of the ashes a new civilization will rise because we're the last ones standing. That white men, and we'll talk about how it became went from Germans to white men, that white men are so superior that we're going to defeat all the brown mud races and all the Jews, and we're going to subjugate all the women, and we will be the last, and when the whole world is destroyed, we will be the last one standing, and out of that we will build our new Rome, our new ethnic apartheid state. That's what they believe. And so it's in a sense it's an eschatological vision that is not, it's not rational. Like it's really just not. But because it's such a powerfully spiritual vector for young men's anger and bitterness and hatred, and all these words I mean in a very literal sense. I don't mean them disparagingly, as in the men are actually angry, like sinfully angry. They are actually bitter about their life circumstances for whatever reason, right? So they have these feelings. Once they get a purchase in the man's heart, you can drive him around with them if you're sophisticated enough. And so if it's just one dogmatic leader doing it, you get an Adolf Hitler type figure. And then, yeah, that's plenty bad. But once you start introducing a demonic spiritual element to it, it becomes so much worse. It becomes theological, not political. And it starts taking on this sort of like starry-eyed, mystical kind of perspective where you can believe almost anything. People will blow themselves up for their religion, and this is ultimately no different. And so I bet if you were to ask many of the Islamic terrorists, they would say that by destroying civilization, the Muslim caliphate would rise. And so it's not a somehow new or novel idea. It's something that the human soul, particularly men, seems uniquely susceptible to. And it's an article of faith led by their cults of personality, their spiritual elite, that are telling them, if you do this, if you give your life in service of this cause, the white nation, the white state will rise, and ultimately all that happens is people's lives get destroyed, because that's Satan's point. He just wants to take individuals down to hell with him, and this is a very effective strategy, I think. Real quick, before you reply, I do want to answer your question about how did it go from being German German men to white men as a whole. And it's good that you picked up on that, because the way that it seems to have happened in Europe, in the UK, and also America, is through immigration. In the case of Britain, they imported workers, to fill the demand created by so many British men who died in the war. And it was the presence of these colored immigrants, as Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke calls them. It was the presence of these colored immigrants that seems to have activated something inside the British, and also it was the emancipation of blacks in America that activated something inside American men. And so, and it was when you take that, so a white, either American or British man or whatever, seeing someone of color and having a reaction to them as if they're the other, and when you take that and you fuse it together with the protocols of the elders of Zion, then it's suddenly this ancient, not ancient, but this old, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory book. When you fuse these two ideas together, why is this brown person here taking my job or whatever? It's because of the Jews. You know who else was right about the Jews? Adolf Hitler. And so that's how the idea, Adolf Hitler was fighting on behalf of all of us. We just didn't realize it at the time. He was right about the world. Maybe he wasn't fighting the same enemies we were in quite the same way. He wasn't fighting against colored immigrants, for example, but he was fighting against the Jews. And we now see that the Jews, through the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Jews are creating the problems that I'm facing right now. Hitler had it right. And they go and they read Mein Kampf and they see all that. So this is going to, in the next chapters, we're going to read about Savitri Devi, who I think her name has shown up in all three of the chapters that we've read so far. Hers is the only name that's shown up in all three of the chapters. And she does a lot of that work also, which we'll see. Another woman, ironically. But that's how the idea makes the jump, is you have Hitler was right about the Jews and everything. He was a prophet. And now we're seeing the after effects of the Jews now. And in order to destroy Jewish civilization, however we conceive of it, whether it's materialist or decadent or feminine or whatever, we have to destroy Jewish civilization with our own violence. And when we collapsed all of civilization, then the new state will rise. That's the mindset that's percolating as soon as like the 1950s, essentially.
Yeah. Thank you. One last follow-up question, and it's more of a comment too. Is it just for practical reasons that there's this love-hate relationship with Christianity? Some of it, it seems like the neo-Nazis take to make their leaders like Christ-like figures, and then Evola just outright comes out against it and calls it feminine and weak and wants a resurgence of Rome. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a rhyme or reason to it. Maybe I haven't read enough of the book yet, but if you could help me understand that, or maybe just tell me to wait and read the rest of the book, that's fine as well.
No, that's fine. So the love-hate Christianity, you mean like they hate the Christian religion, but they turn Hitler or whoever into a messianic figure? Is that
Correct,
kind of what you're asking
correct.
about?
Yeah, they take in the forms and symbols, right? But they call it weak and feminist, and so it's like, how do you justify? Like, it seems to me it's a very paradoxical, and like you said, what was the word you said? It seems like it's not internally consistent. But again, none of this stuff is right. It's demonic. But again, I'm just trying to understand something maybe that can't be understood.
No, I mean, you're very insightful to point out these inherent contradictions, that a particular German phenomenon has suddenly become universal. Like Adolf Hitler didn't really have much affinity for the French, I think, right? But somehow Frenchmen get called white as well, and British and Americans are suddenly white when he was fighting against all of them. And yet this particular German phenomenon now becomes about them. That's contradiction one. That, like, how are we going to build a higher civilization through thuggish violence, is contradiction two. And we hate Christianity, and our preferred guy is a messianic figure. Like this is like, as my pastor says, sin makes you stupid. Like they're not thinking that deeply about. They're really not thinking that deeply about it. They're like, even Evola is probably the deepest thinker that we've encountered so far, and even he's just a hedonist who's wrapping it in spiritual trappings. And so I think a lot of this has to do, like, if we could plonk ourselves down in the middle of some of these meetings and be like, raise our hand, like, excuse me, I have a question. Wouldn't that be fun? But I think you're very right to detect these internal you're very right to detect these internal contradictions, and that they're nonsensical. And I think if I had to guess, it's that cognitive dissonance, that internal tension that probably motivates also a lot of anger, because I don't think the human mind generally deals with cognitive dissonance very well. And it tends to those who don't have a righteous way to resolve it, it tends to make them angry and violent. And I think these three things together probably cause a lot of tension for men that didn't realize them or were only grappling with them subconsciously, let's say.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great questions. Anybody else? All right, cool. While I'm talking through this next section, if you have more questions, just jump in. But for the next meeting, we have Imperium in chapter 4, Imperium and the New Atlantis, Savitri Devi and the Hitler Avatar, and then I think also the Nazi mysteries. That's about 50 pages. I do want to start speeding up just a little bit, but maybe not too much. So let's plan on chapters 4, 5, and 6. And you'll see now as we get to this middle section of the book how, the first 2 chapters are more material in character. But as soon as we hit Julius Evola, things start to get very weird and spiritual in character, and that's only going to accelerate. So that turning point, that pivot point at page 52, once we start to get to chapters 4, 5, and 6, things are going to start to get super weird, particularly in like chapters 8 and 9. But for now, let's focus on chapters 4, 5, and 6, and you'll get some updates on Substack about that. Thank you all very much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you at the next book club.